A cool autumn morning in mid-October is where our story begins, in a small but quaint town near Clemson County, where the Tugaloo River stands. My friends and I, Elle and Jay, went up to the mountainous region to enjoy a weekend full of camping. What we planned to do, aside from lodging and camping out in a rustic cabin, was to hike the vast trails and rugged terrain, to hunt for our meals and sleep underneath the stars. Our trip was planned in advance, and as such, all of us thought we had everything covered, every contingency prepared for. But as we would later discover, we were horrifically wrong in that assumption of ours. Our first morning in the mountains was met with a beautiful sunrise, the likes of which I doubt any of us had ever seen before. Steadily it rose to grace us, blessing all its light touched with warmth and loving radiance. Groggily I got out of bed, still exhausted from the previous night, as I was the one who drove for the last half of the trip. After waking up a little more, I got dressed and headed downstairs to meet the rest of my group, Elle and Jay. As we gathered and sat down for breakfast, we began to discuss the first thing we would do that day, laughing our asses off as we joked and prodded at one another, teasing, making jabs, in an effort to get one of us to drive about the area, so the others didn't have to. We finished packing for the day ahead of us and loaded into the car, the attempts at persuasion from earlier failing me, as I ended up driving yet again. And so began our trek into the wilderness around us. Works for me, I thought, as I drove down the winding trail. I get to see it all up front, while those two make out in the back seat. Now to each their own. I know, but I was a little bit disgruntled at them for not taking in the scenery, so I decided to sweeten the mood. Apparently swerving on a winding incline was not the best course of action, even jokingly, as my prank was soon met with a hard smack to the face. "What the hell?" Elle exclaimed. "Are you gonna be retarded the whole trip?" I chuckled. "Calm down, I was just horsing around. I mean, you two are having your fair share of fun. Isn't it right I only get to have mine?" Elle sneered and said, "Please don't do it again. You just about made me wet myself. I thought we were gonna perish. If you're gonna joke around like that, at least make sure we're not on a narrow bend like this, okay?" I sighed. "Okay, I'm sorry. My apologies, Your Highness." After a while, I chuckled again and said, "You know, if I want to be lectured, I'd stay at home and have my ear talked off by my mother." We'd finally reached our destination. The fallen leaves decorated the forest floor, crisply crunching underfoot as we made our way further into the hiking trail, walking deeper into the wooded realm that encompassed us. The trail was peaceful, filled with moments of silence and beauty, all of which was jovially brought to an end as Jay, being the country fan he is, began whistling a beloved tune. Soon we all chimed in, singing "Take Me Home, Country Roads," as none of us could resist the urge to sing to such a camp-friendly song. We continued humming various melodies, the last marking of the day's end as the sun began to set. The final tune escaped our lips as the moon began to rise, signaling the night's arrival, and with it, the subjects to its rule. The moon's full paleness and eerie light crept through the brambles and thickets of branches, its sickly touch sending chills down our backs. A cold shiver ran throughout our bodies, and Elle began to cling to Jay, obviously frightened, and said, "Dill, maybe we should get going, like, now." You see, Elle's my best friend, and in the time we've known each other, whenever either of us gets a bad feeling, we take heed and turn away from the supposed risk. Just as we started to head back in the direction of the car, a shrill cry rang out, a deafening and blood-chilling wail that snatched away whatever peace and tranquility was left in that night. We stood frozen, with fear as our shackles, anxiety and uncertainty the ball and chain. What the hell was that? Jay quickly asked. Elle hugged him tighter. Did you hear that, Dill? We began to scan the area around us, making out whatever we could in the pale moonlit night. Our ears twitching at every sound they heard, our hearts slowing to a rhythmic pump as we fixated on something in the distance. What appeared to be two glowing, whitish-yellow orbs were in a nearby tree. As quickly as we saw them, the orbs vanished, and that horrific wail resounded soon after, leaving us motionless from fear. Courage or stupidity took hold of us, and we booked it back to the car against our better judgment, as running from a predator was a bad idea due to their instinct to hunt and give chase to fleeing prey. We all came to the unified and unspoken decision that staying there with that thing was a worse idea than doing nothing. Finally, we made it. Jay and Elle got in first and I followed suit. Again, in the driver's seat, and I started the car. As soon as the headlights flicked on, there, in the brush, just barely visible but perceivable enough to make out from its most horrific visage, stood an actual monster. There are no other words for it. Its sickly pale yellow eyes stared into our souls as we looked back with the utmost horror imaginable. Our gaze met. It knew we were terrified of it, and honestly, it took pride in such a notion. Its skin was a reddened color, like tanned hide, only slightly darker, while its face, from what little we could see, was sharp and angular. On the next tree to it lay one of its grotesque hands, just as monstrous as the rest of it, adorned with claws at the tips of its curled, elongated fingers. One leg was partially visible, and, much to our dismay, was bent and misshapen. That's when we knew, if this was a prank, it was the best damn prank ever, as no human leg is able to bend like that. Imagine how a dog's leg would be, or some other animal, with the knee bent backwards, heels resting off the ground, all the while the pads of its feet lay nestled on the forest floor, its sharp claws digging into the dirt and leaves beneath where it stood. Then it cracked what appeared to be a smile, revealing rows of sharp and gnarled teeth, or dare I say, fangs. All of this, as drawn out as it seems, happened in the span of a minute or two. Just as quickly as we saw it, though, it slithered away back into the brush. What in the ever-loving hell was that thing? I asked, fear stinging my throat, tears burning my eyes, with Elle and Jay yelling at me to drive away. I snapped back to reality, threw the car into reverse, turned around, and gunned it down the path. To hell if it was a narrow road, and on that notion we agreed. After what felt like an anxiety-ridden eternity, we finally arrived back at the cabin and slowly made our way inside. Not out of nonchalance or lack of care, but from shock and exhaustion, complete with utter disbelief. We all decided to sleep in the same room that night, huddled around one another, cold and pale as the grave. Elle was passed out from all the excitement of it all, while Jay was soon to follow from a rundown of his adrenaline high drive. But I managed to stay awake for a while longer, gripping tightly onto my hunting utensil as I sat on the edge of the bed. I tossed and turned and awoke at every sound that came from the woods, unable to get any decent sleep for what seemed to be hours upon hours, until I finally gave in to the idea of a well-rested night. Screw that. I gave a defeated sigh. I couldn't sleep. I went downstairs for a drink and a bite to eat, still on edge as my heart pounded in my chest. There I sat in the kitchen, eating my midnight snack, drinking away whatever that thing was from my memory. All of a sudden, as if on some dreadful cue, a chill runs down my back. It's the same chill I felt right before that creature showed up. A feeling of a lurking nearby danger, one that heralds the tendency for someone to proceed with an air of caution. A light tapping sounded at the window, and without thinking, I turned to look. In the darkness, 2 whitish, yellow eyes shone from outside, beaming into the cabin as whatever they belonged to searched around. Then, they rose higher into the air, resting almost above the window frame. Whatever this thing was, it was tall, frightfully so. It put its hand on the window, but in the moonlight, it looked wet and redder than it did before. A fresh, vicious substance dripping from its claws. Slowly I backed away, and it did the same, but neared closer and closer to the door as it stepped from the window. Seeing the door was unlocked, I bolted for it and slammed up against it as it creaked, knocking whatever that hideous thing was away and locking the door. I heard a slight grunt and what sounded like a growl before it spoke. "Let me in, Bill," Elle said from behind the door, her voice deepening and becoming more sinister in tone. "There's a monster out here. Please don't let him get me." I stood there, weapon in hand, tears welling in my eyes, a gasp in my throat, and then it spoke again. But this time it wasn't in Elle's voice. Jay spoke, sinisterly and maliciously, taunting us to open the door. "Let me in, little boy, let me in." It slammed against the door and let out this horrific wail. Then an ungodly scream. Jay and Elle ran downstairs, looking as shocked and horrified as I felt. "Let me in," it demanded again. "Jay, open the door, please. It's not me in there with you." Jay became as white as a ghost, and then Elle fell to the ground, passed out from fear and disbelief. "Dylan, Dylan, Dylan." It began to laugh and then spoke in my voice. "If everyone else is having fun, isn't it only fair that I get my fair share too?" I blacked out after that. Morning came, the sun creeping over the horizons, slowly gracing us again. This sunrise was similar to the previous morning, and we finally understood why it had risen so slowly. It wasn't a gradual, majestic sunlight. It was quite the opposite. Disturbed, scared, reluctant to mantle the throne in the heavens above us. We finally understood, and after packing up, we got the hell out of there and never returned. The mountains grew distant and soon faded as I drove back home, although admittedly, I didn't mind being the driver this time. Elle and Jay refused to return there to the sprawling mountains, forested providence of Clemson County. But one day, I will. I love the woods and mountains. Nature itself is too much to be deterred by whatever evil lurks within the darkness there. I just pray that when I do venture back to the Clemson County retreat, all goes well for me, and that I return alive and sane. Here's to hoping. This happened a little over a year ago, on a Sunday early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog, Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means. At that time, I felt very safe around her and would often take her for walks in a forest that was nearby. The day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I immediately got out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her, since I'd smell like her for the rest of the day. I put my leash on her and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He always thought that we would go down a road and back, but I always kind of found it more interesting to take her to the forest. I always felt a certain kind of peace and relaxation there that was unmatched by anything else. So we took a turn and headed to the forest. Usually when there, I would take her leash off so she could explore on her own. Most of the time I'd carve my name into the trees or look for anything interesting. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, presumably from an old table. That's when I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't the usual bark when we're in the forest. I thought it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox, it wouldn't attack, but I had a sense of security while I was holding it. I called out, "Molly?" She continued barking. This was very strange, since she always comes when I call her. I followed the sound of her barks and stumbled across a scene I will never forget. There was a man, probably in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, let alone half naked carrying a big-ass machete. He was ignoring Molly completely and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation. Even now, I have no idea how I would handle it. "Sir, are you okay?" I asked in confusion. I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time. He turned around, revealing his face. He had some of the clearest blue eyes I have ever seen to this day. I could see them so well because they were so wide. "Come here, boy. Look what I've dug up." I was afraid that I didn't listen to him, he would start to chase me, and that was something I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer but kept a good distance. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle. I used this window of time to get my dog and started walking away slowly, as to not notify him that I was leaving. But then I took one final glance at the man. His head was dug deep in the hole. I was intrigued, so I kept looking. I know it was foolish of me. He got up from the ground, and I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea which animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. I had seen enough and began sprinting away with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and that's when I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was the machete. I heard him yell, "Damn it!" This made me run even faster. I knew the forest very well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost. I ripped through branches and bushes until I got out of there, and didn't stop sprinting until I arrived at the garage, where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. I didn't tell him a single thing about the man, since I was afraid that he would get angry and would never allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, I never went to that forest alone again. Man with the machete and bone in his mouth, I have no intention of coming across you again. I was doing a geologist in the park through the National Park Service at Yellowstone back in the early 80s. It was a summer gig. First thing I do when I take groups around the mud pot geysers or any sort of thermal area, I tell them in no uncertain terms, stay on the boardwalk, don't put anything into the thermal features, don't throw trash, coins or put your hands or feet in. Stay on the boardwalk, only take pictures, stay behind any barricades, leave only footprints on the boardwalk, and stay on the boardwalk. Although I didn't really have any sort of official power or legal standing beyond that of your average blue passport holder, I was large, biker beard, corn-fed cheesehead large, loud and seriously into geology and preservation of a geologically unique area. Multitudinous times I had to warn people to stay on the boardwalk, to not throw anything into the thermal features, and the rest of the litany, and, for the most part, people would conform, adding the usual amount of grumbling and grousing, until I took an all-French group around on a blistering July afternoon. I spoke no French, but most of the tourists spoke some English, and one who volunteered to be my paravuchek de jour. I began with the official lines of don'ts, and these were all loudly translated into French for the whole group to hear. I even called out a few that were chatting amongst themselves, "Listen up, this is for your benefit, you digging me?" and reviewed the list again. Anyone got any questions? Nods and mumbles of agreement about what I received from many groups. So off we go on the latest tour of geothermal wonders and geological splendor. About halfway through, there are always stragglers, so I halt the tour to wait for the dawdlers to catch up. Behind my back I hear a commotion and see one of the beret-sporting no-beards off the boardwalk. What did I say? They're wandering closer to the glory pool to get a better picture or something like that. I get to the translator and ask him to scream to tell him to get back here, while 3 or 4 others decide it would be best to go and get him. General panic in Detroit moments until they all finally scarper back on the boardwalk, only to have one tourist tap me on the shoulder and ask if that person over there in the opposite direction should be there. There was yet another one of the group stalking a deer that wandered in, wondering what all the commotion was about. Evidently, since he was heading away from the thermal feature, he would be just as safe as houses going off to photog the deer. He wasn't. The grounds around any thermal area are treacherous as hell. The water table shifts on a daily basis due to different thermal flux. Old Yellowstone caldera controls, so what may support you yesterday may be mere millimeters thick today. He broke through the crust and into the superheated geothermal heater water and mud, nature's napalm as they call it, up to about chest depth. I immediately called for rescue services via radio, told the French crowd not to move and stay there or be arrested, and I cautiously worked my way over towards him. We'd been trained for this sort of stuff, and hoped to hell it would never happen to try and drag him out. It was touch and go, but belly crawling, swearing a blue streak, and luck of the Irish prevailed. I got his arm and slowly dragged him out. He was screaming like a gaffed calf, out on less vicious terrain. He lived, although with massive third-degree burns, a hefty fine, and his banning from US national parks for life. I starved at a boys' summer scout camp in southeast Missouri, nestled on a huge and mostly unused property surrounded by the Ozark/Mark Twain National Forest. Just a few minutes outside the property is a small hilltop park converted from a retired forest ranger's fire tower. It's got wooden stairs that lead about halfway up to the tower to an enclosed platform that you can observe the landscape for a few miles over. It was often frequented by other staffers on their respective nights off, and sometimes you'd run into some less than savory locals that mostly used it for debauchery. It was a popular place among staffers as it provided a tranquil and relaxing space to just chill out, away from the chaos that is camp. I have been there many times in the 2 years prior to my 3rd summer. It was always a normal and quiet place. So, one Saturday evening, on my 3rd year, my girlfriend at the time was visiting. I wanted to take her to all the cool spots, so after dinner and a movie, I took her to the fire tower. It wasn't super late, although it was the darker side of twilight. But when we arrived, we were the only ones there. Although not out of the ordinary, this was slightly unusual, as the camps on the property shared Saturday nights off, outside of special weekend events we hosted once or twice a summer. Thinking nothing of it, I told my girlfriend I just wanted to sit in the truck for a minute. I had a 94 Chevy S10 with a sick turquoise camper shell. We rolled down the windows and enjoyed the cool evening summer breeze. Not a minute or two later, my girlfriend asks me, "Hey, what's that noise?" And I perk up, because I hadn't noticed anything at all. I'm straining to listen to some sort of foreign sound, when I hear what sounds like drum beats being produced from mid-air in a big ring around the car. The individual beats would sound at different distances and elevations, with no discernible rhythmical pattern. It sounded a lot like the drums from In the Deep from Fellowship of the Rings. We were both sitting there, a little bewildered, when I started to scan the area for the source of the noise. I looked up and down the tower to see if anyone's needlessly stomping their feet as hard as possible on the wooden steps, creating an echoing noise. Nobody. I looked down at the little bench area at the bottom of the tower. Nothing. I checked the parking lot again to see if somehow I missed another parked vehicle on our way in. Nope. We were the only ones there. By this point, I know that something weird is going on, and I roll up the windows and lock the door. My girlfriend is still confused, but she's never been here before, so she doesn't realize how unnatural this sound is. The drum beats have picked up, and it seems like they're slowly but steadily closing in on the truck, progressively getting louder. The hair on my arms and neck stands up straight, as I can tell the beats are actually approaching us in the truck. All of a sudden, I hear the beat right behind the camper shell window, right behind the cab of the truck. I fling myself around to see if there's anything in the bed of the truck, but I see nothing. However, as soon as I turn over my right shoulder to look back, I expose my back to the driver's side window, and immediately, a drum beat happens just outside my window. Just remembering this, I get chills down my back, as if whatever was doing this was intentional and intelligent. It picked the bed first because my back was exposed and vulnerable, got me to turn around, and it was as if it was taunting me. At this point, dread washed over me, and I felt like we needed to leave immediately, or we'd be in some serious danger. My fight or flight kicked in so hard I began to cry uncontrollably, flying down the gravel road, way too fast to be safe. The noise did not pursue nor continue. But needless to say, when we got back to camp, I was so shaken I had to go straight to bed. I've been back a few times since, but nothing like this has ever happened again. I asked some other camp staff buddies if they had experienced or heard anything similar like this at the fire tower, but nobody had anything noteworthy to say. My ex-girlfriend still remembers that night, but maintains that she never felt any fear, just a curiosity of what was making that noise. If anyone has any thoughts or ideas, I'm open to hearing what you think. I used to live out in the middle of nowhere. The town had less than 200 people in it. I used to work through the night in one of the metro areas, and it was about a 40-minute drive with about 15 of it on a country road. I used to think I would see stuff in the fields, like coyote, deer all the time. Never thought twice. Well, one morning I was on my way home at roughly 3 a.m. and we had a little bridge to cross right before we got to our road. As I'm closing in on crossing the bridge, I can see something pearly white hanging out in the middle of the road. I thought it was probably a swan and it would move. As I got closer, I realized that swans are not that big. I was in an F-150, and it was at eye level with me. When its wings opened up, it literally covered both lanes of traffic. I swerved to miss it but hit something of the wing. I slammed on my brakes and turned around. Whatever it was 100% gone without a trace, and I never saw it again. If it was a bird, it's the biggest bird I've ever seen. Oh, and I also need to let you know that I didn't live by any large body of water. I was hiking in the Carpathian Mountains and got a chance to speak with the local mountain rangers. A lone hiker had passed the ranger's cabin wearing sneakers and footwear and without gloves. It being winter, the ranger had told the guy that he's not properly equipped and should probably turn back, but without effect. Once it had been dark for a few hours and there was no signs of the hiker returning, they headed out for the rescue. The guy was lucky to be found alive. He was lying bleeding in a pit in the snow with stains all over himself and the surroundings. It turned out he had read that cutting your hands will keep you warm and prevent your fingers from getting frostbitten. Maybe the guy got his mountain survival tips from the same sources anti-vaxxers get their medical advice. My name is Jack. This story took place outside Minot, North Dakota when I was 17. My church group was having a backyard bash. Basically, all the ones who play music in the surrounding congregation in North Dakota get together in one of the members' backyards and play music, cook awesome food, and hang out with some truly great people. This took place the night before. All the guys my age were hanging out late at Jared's house. If any of you are familiar with Minot, this took place across the Bison Trail before Velna. Anyway, that night all the guys were watching Hot Rod inside at about 11 p.m. Evan, Jared, Tyler, my younger brother, and myself decided to go outside and talk and hang out by Evan's girly truck he was way too proud of. His house was on a hill. The driveway went about 100 feet where Evan's truck was parked. The front yard slowly declined to the road and field, flattened out for about 300 feet, then inclined up a sizable hill. It was pitch black at the time. We were all around Evan's truck, just chatting and having fun. 20 minutes into our conversation, Evan interrupts us and asks if we heard that. We all stopped and said no. I asked what he heard, and he said it sounded like a deep, grunting grasp noise. We all listened for anything and heard nothing but bugs, so we brushed it off, but Evans seemed uneasy. Another 10 minutes into our chat, and we all stopped talking naturally as we paused to think about what to talk about. And just then we heard it again, all of us in unison. The noise was this deep grunt exhale noise that had all of us stop and look towards the direction it came from. We didn't see anything. Evan had his keys and decided to turn on his headlights as it was parked in the right direction. We saw a pair of eyes, shining in the light, just on the outside reach of his headlights, about 400 feet away. I ran inside to grab a maglite, the most recognizable flashlight ever created, and I ran to the edge of the road and Jared came along. I twisted the end to focus the light in a straight beam and found it. A white-tailed buck, a big one, climbing up the hill from bottom right to top left. I found the animal with the beam focused on it, and we were about 250 feet away. The deer stopped and stared at us. I started talking to it, just saying the usual things. "Hey buddy, what you doing out here?" And after about 2 minutes of us talking to him, and him just staring at us, it started to resume its course. But then we heard that same noise again. A grunt, a deep exhale. Jared and I looked at each other puzzled, and I put the light on him again while he was walking up the hill. But something was wrong. It was limping badly. We knew something was wrong. And that's when it happened. We heard a roar 50 feet from our right, the scariest sound I've ever heard, but I've heard it before, in movies and games. Mountain lion. It was the first time hearing it in person, but I knew it was angry, basically saying get the hell away from my meal or I'll have you for dessert. When it roared, Jared and I looked at each other and booked it back to the house. Tyler and Evan were still by the truck while we were down there, but they reacted the same way we did because when we passed the truck in our retreat, they were holding the house door open for us. We told a few of the guys that we were still up and nobody bought it, but we knew what we saw and heard. Mountain lions 3 miles outside of town in North Dakota? Yeah, okay, I know they're rare, but they're there. We were pretty shaken about it, but the next morning my brother and I went to go look for tracks, blood trails or carcasses. We got to the point where we found the deer. We were walking up to where I put my arm out in front of my brother to stop us both, and I heard a rattling. I then saw a rattlesnake pop up 10 feet away and decided the universe was giving us stop signs, so we went back. I lost contact with Jared over time. Evan turned out to be a pretty messed up person that I didn't want to be around anymore, but my brother and I are still close, and we talk about that night to this day. Mountain lions are my favorite animal, and from this encounter I have the utmost respect for them, but after this night, I never went out hiking, biking or walking in that area without protection, for a fight I would lose, because I have a feeling I would not get a second warning. I once escorted a church group, young kids through to adults, on a weekend overnight outing to a camp in the Poconos. The camp was set at the confluence of 2 streams and was somewhat rugged. The group had lots to do, a climbing wall, boating, hiking, sports, all kinds of stuff, including a nature center and a little museum. The nature center had interactive displays, fish tanks, small animals and a touch table. A large wooden table with sides on, which was scattered with all sorts of artifacts that the guests could pick up and handle. These items included deer antlers, bones, turtle shells, feathers, arrowheads, and pottery, rocks, seeds and nuts, tanned hides, etc. Little kids especially loved it. All the items were found by guests or staff while out in camp and returned to the nature center. I handled the items also, and I noticed one bone that had a really odd shape. I'm an environmental scientist by profession and an outdoorsman and naturalist for fun, and can generally recognize what bones come from what part of what animal. This bone was a human mandible, the lower jawbone of a person. It was severely worn, smooth, and had no teeth, but easily recognizable as such. It had been there for years, handled by thousands of people, and no one noticed or at least reported it. I reported it to the director, who removed it and notified the state police. They investigated and it seemed very old, and no one was reported missing in the immediate area, so the camp wasn't allowed to keep it. Possible explanation? The facility was the site of a timbering and ice harvesting camp up until the 1920s, and may have been the remains of a worker who perished and was buried right there. But who knows the real story? As far as I know, it's still on the table. Do any of you remember Outdoor Ed? If you don't remember, or just plain don't know, I'll give you a brief rundown. Outdoor education, or ED for short, is a school camping trip that takes students to the woods where they can learn more about the outdoors. My Outdoor Ed's trip took me to the snow-infested mountains, and for the most part it was completely boring save for the occasional snowball fight. Then the last night occurred, and I will never forget it for as long as I live. Now before that night, I didn't have any trouble sleeping, but the last night, it was like something was wrong. At first I assumed it was just homesickness, first time away from my parents, you see. But then I looked to my cabin mates and counselor, and From the look on their face, I could tell they were feeling it too. It was a tense several minutes, and then something started calling our names. It was barely more than a whisper, but all of us heard it. The voice seductive, alluring. It made us want to go outside, but the small amount of common sense I had in the back of my head ordered me to stay put. Charlie. My counselor did not feel the same way and left the cabin to investigate. We could hear him yelling from outside. Come on, guys. This isn't funny. The kids are trying to sleep. I guess he assumed it was some sort of prank. After a few minutes of silence, he rushed back inside. There's someone out here. Stay inside. He grabbed something from his bag and left. Listen, this is your only warning. I'm armed, and if you intend to hurt these kids, I will shoot. There was silence, and I heard the loudest noise I'd ever heard. 2 consecutive bangs. I could hear the other counselors come outside and hear them talk. I can't hear what they say, but my counselor comes back and says that for the rest of the night we have to stay indoors. Eventually, I slept and drifted out. Next morning, as the students are boarding the buses to leave, we see police cars on the road and police officers talking to my counselor. He described it as something barely resembling a human, taller than 10 feet, with skin so pale you could mistake it for snow. It was all he could see before he fired and the creature ran off. Suffice to say, I've had nightmares about it and am now forbidden from going on any more camping trips. Now that I'm a bit older and a little bit wiser, my best guess is that it was a wendigo. But this was Southern California, an unusual place for such a cryptid. I live in rural Idaho, about 5 miles from a reservation. Growing up, we heard all sorts of stories and legends surrounding the res. I have to admit, I was a bit of a skeptic when it came to the things we heard. My best friend and I have always been drawn to the paranormal. When we were about 16, 17, we decided we'd go for drives on the res at night. The area we live in has a very tight-knit community, and our little town has just over 10,000 people. We basically have no crime, and everyone feels pretty safe, so driving around at night is no big deal. We went on our night's drive fairly often, with no experiences to note. One day, we had heard a story from someone at school about an abandoned schoolhouse on the other side of the reservation. Just past the schoolhouse, there was supposed to be a small bridge that went over a large farming canal. The story was that if you drove to the bridge and turned off your car, you could hear water babies. If you don't know what water babies are, they are a Native American folk tale. They're supposed to be sprites in the shape of babies or young infants, and hearing their cry is allegedly an omen of death, or perhaps something terrible. So anyway, we decided this was going to be our next driving destination. Neither of us had ever heard a water baby cry, so we were interested. That night after dark, we jumped in my car and started driving out there. The closer we got to the schoolhouse, the more uneasy I began to feel. We drove past the building that was supposed to be the schoolhouse and stopped on the bridge. I cut the lights and killed the engine. There was silence. There was no sound but the rushing water below the bridge. We sat there for what felt like forever, but in reality was probably no more than 4 to 5 minutes. We heard nothing but the water. We started joking about the stories being fake and decided that it was time to go home. The keys were still in the ignition, so I simply tried to start the car. Nothing. The dash lights lit up, but it just wouldn't turn over. I'd never had any problem with the car before. I tried a few more times while talking to my friend, not wanting to freak her out. About the 3rd or 4th time, I turned to her and said, "I don't want to freak you out, but the car, won't start. Her eyes grew wide and she responded with, "You're kidding me, right?" I wish I had been. We sat there for a minute just staring at each other, not knowing what to do. If we called my mum, there would definitely be some arse chewing for being out on the res so late at night. So we decided to call one of our friends that had a truck. If the battery was dead, he could give us a jump. If not, he could tow us back to town, I suppose. So we called and waited, sitting in the middle of this bridge in my dead car, frustrated from the lack of experience and car troubles. We just wanted to go home. That's when I saw it. It's a well-known fact that the reservation has packs of wild dogs that roam around, killing livestock, and there have been a few instances of them attacking kids and putting them in the hospital. This was no dog. I've seen coyotes and wolves, and there was no way in hell this was either of those things. It was skeletal, like a malnutritioned animal, and walking on all fours, slow and low to the ground. It was walking along the canal towards the bridge. I smacked my friend, making her turn to look at what I was staring at. We both stared in disbelief at this creature slowly coming towards us. Instinctively, I honked the horn. At least that still worked. That's when things got really weird. This thing stood up on two legs, arms limp at its sides, and I legit screamed. I had never seen anything like this in my entire life. The best way I can think to describe it is it looked like Professor Lupin's werewolf form in Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. It was massive. It stood between 8 to 9 feet tall and was staring at us. It took a few steps forward, and my friend and I were frozen. We were trapped in a car that we couldn't start. As it slowly started walking towards us, headlights appeared in the distance. As the lights came closer, the creature dropped back to all fours and took off for the hills where I assumed it came from. Our friend pulled up to help us, and both my creeped out friend and I kept quiet about what we had just witnessed. He walked up to the car, and I rolled my window down. He suggested we push the car off the bridge to the side of the road and pop the hood. So I threw it in neutral, got to the side of the road, and my friend asked me to pop the hood and try to start the car. So I did. The damn car started right up. I don't know what caused it to not start before, but that night I had an experience I'll never forget, and I don't go out on the res anymore at night. I'd rather not see whatever it was that night again. I went over to my boyfriend Ashton's grandparents' house. They live just outside of town in the country. His parents have a little camper out there, and we go there to sleep or just hang out for a day. He was making the fire while I was playing a video game with his little sister and brother. After the fire was started, I started to make s'mores for his brother and I. He asked me if I wanted to go to the woods with him and make a teepee. I wasn't too thrilled of the idea at first, because I just wanted to stay at the camper and make s'mores. His sister Serenity asked if she could come too, so I went with them. We started walking down this long path until we made a right turn, heading into the woods. It was a hot summer's day, so I was wearing shorts and a tank top and my black Converse. Serenity and I followed him down a hill to the next road we were walking on and throughout the woods. He knew exactly where he was going. He said it would be a great place to make a teepee because it was hidden from the road and no one would see us nor the teepee. Ashton began to start building it while Serenity and I were gathering big sticks and putting them in a pile. When the teepee was made, it was about 6 o'clock, and we sat there, inside it, and began watching a movie from his phone. Once the movie was over, it was starting to get dark, so we decided to head back to the camper. That's when Serenity tripped over a big root and fell down, twisting her ankle and bashing her knee on the ground. Ashton tried to get her to her feet, but she couldn't do it. She was in so much pain. The teepee wasn't too far away, so we just headed back there to give Serenity a place to rest her foot for a little while. Ashton just set another fire while Serenity and I watched another movie on his phone. It was around 8 o'clock when the movie was done, and the fire had started to dwindle. Serenity ended up falling asleep. Ashton tried to wake her, but she didn't move. He didn't want to walk, because it was too dark to see, and he didn't want to trip over something, dropping Serenity on the ground or hurting himself. We opted to sleep there for the night and walk back early in the morning. We thought the quicker we fell asleep, the quicker morning would come, so we huddled up and fell asleep. We were all asleep when suddenly we heard a loud screaming sound. It sounded like a high-pitched screech. We all woke up, jumping out of our skin. I checked my phone, which was on 4%, and it was 3 a.m. Ashton sat right up and silently looked out. I was beside him. We were staring at the little door that he'd made of the teepee. It was too dark to even see anything, until we heard movement from outside. Then it went silent again, and then the movement returned. We heard another loud screech, and the branches outside breaking. Ashton reached for his wood knife and held it close to him, looking at the flap that was flapping ever so slightly. There was no wind at all, and the flap kept moving from side to side. I was hugging Serenity at this point, terrified to see what was going to happen next. Then we heard another loud screech right outside the teepee. Whatever that was, or whoever that was, screeched 5 or 6 more times until it finally stopped. After a while that felt like an eternity, it was nearly 6 a.m. The sun was almost out. Serenity couldn't take it anymore, and she really wanted to leave because she was petrified about the last night. We packed up our things and got out of there. Serenity's ankles still really hurt so badly that Ashton carried her for the rest of the way. When we got back, Ashton's dad came running to us, including his little brother, asking where we'd been and why we didn't return and if we were okay. We told him what happened and why we ended up sleeping in the woods. He told us we needed to leave now, so we all got in the car and went home. When we got to his dad's place, he seemed a bit shaken up. When he asked his dad what was up, his dad told him when we didn't come back from the woods later that day, he waited a little bit longer, and when night came, he called the police, and they came pretty fast. He told him that his son and daughter were missing along with the son's girlfriend, and the last place he'd seen us were when we were walking down the long road towards the bush. The officer then apparently told his dad to get inside and lock all the doors, and not to come back out until they got him. His dad was confused, but listened. A few hours went by, and that's when his dad heard the loud screeching sound coming from the woods. Then he heard it again and again, until it finally stopped. The officers returned at 4 a.m. and said they didn't find anything, but they did tell his dad why they told him to get into the house right away. There was someone who broke out of prison just a few miles down that road. The prisoner got out a few days ago and was still on the lookout. Turns out, he was convicted for taking people's lives. They thought he must have been hiding somewhere deep in the woods where no one would find him. His dad asked them what the loud screeching sound at 4 a.m. was, and the officers looked confused and asked what he was talking about. They ended up having to leave for another call. They told his dad to have a good day and that they would be back. Ashton's dad seemed very scared about the sound he heard. He didn't want us to think he was crazy, until Ashton told him he wasn't, because that night we heard the same thing, and someone was definitely outside our teepee that night. I'm just happy that nothing bad happened to us while we were out there. This happened about 3 years ago, when some friends and I went hiking on the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina, close to Boone but still a good 30 minutes drive from the start of the trail. We get in a few hours before we start to make camp, so we could beat the time and enjoy the mountain scenery at dusk before it gets dark. We set up tie our food and things in the tree, roll a joint, crack open a few, and enjoy the mountain face overlooking the valley. Truly, the Appalachians are drop-dead gorgeous. Then we hear it. There's just this blood-curdling scream out of nowhere, and it seemed to come from our east, opposite from our campground and the trail. We're all immediately freaked out, with a couple of us yelling out, and one or two pulling out their pistols. We all just stand frozen for a moment, then we hear it again, and then silence. Like that horror movie silence when everything, the trees, the birds, and the wind, just stop. You could hear everyone breathing, like it was in your ear. None of us had cell service, and it was too dark to make our way to anything like civilization. So the four of us just holed up together without sleeping until daybreak. Still a bit freaked, we made our way back to our cars in the parking lot. Now the trails kind of buckle and intersect at time in this area. So we get back, and we'd come close to where we heard the origin of the scream. And lo and behold, we found cougar tracks. We hurried back and contacted the local ranger station to let them know. And the ranger sighed and said, "Yeah, you're not the first to tell us this. So bottom line, those big cats aren't gone." Little backstory here to how I learned my lesson that nature doesn't mess around. Arkansas, the natural state, resident here. I do a side job called trail running. There's a whole bunch of names for it. It's where we work with a tour guide escorting a group by scouting out the nature location a few days in advance to see if there are any hindrances to said nature attractions such as floods, creeks, or fallen trees. Usually I hunt waterfalls because there's about 300 in Arkansas and they attract tourists. But most of them have no trail to get to the location, so I document a path. This isn't a foolproof strategy, as I get off course sometimes by miles. I also prefer traveling by myself and doing the job alone. That was a big mistake, as I also enjoyed the isolation, but sometimes I'd have a friend tag along since they wanted a little money. We don't know what to expect when we search for a path, so to protect against wildlife and the elements, we essentially are armed to the teeth. Our kit involved kneecaps, high steel wading boots, 2 machetes, flare guns, you get the gist. Now for the story. I had one job finding another way to a waterfall called Bowers Hollow, as the main trail was flooded since the waterfall season is from October to August and it rains a lot. I found a back road that gets me to the marked forest area, except the road was no longer a road but a mudslide of some sort, and had wiped out the road a long time ago. The road snakes down into a canyon, and the mudslide hit the road multiple times, causing me to have to disembark my vehicle, as it was only starting to flatten out from water, slowly removing dirt that I could cross it by foot. After 2 hours of hiking down, I came by across a flooded creek. That's usually a good sign because it means there's a waterfall nearby. I hiked downstream for about 3 miles and came across an old Subaru SUV. The vehicle had clearly been there a long time and had scratch marks on the rusted exterior. The vehicle also had an Ontario, Canada license plate, meaning that the person probably wasn't familiar with Arkansas wilderness. The right back window was smashed thoroughly, with glass in the interior of the car, and bits of cloth on the shattered glass still on the window. The left back window was cracked badly, and had not shattered just yet, but was bending outwards in the shape of the top of a head. There were black spotches all over the degraded interior of the car. To the left of the car facing downstream was an untouched campsite with old cans and rocks arranged into the campfire with obvious signs it was untouched for years. I knew that this probably occurred a long time ago, maybe before I was even born as I was 18 at the time. But I got out of there pretty quickly, concluded with my trail guide that a mountain lion had probably attacked a person in their sleep and marked the zone as dangerous wildlife, and have never taken a job in that area since. I live just where farmland meets the outer edge of suburbia, on an island off the coast of British Columbia. The climate here is sub-temperate rainforest, so the natural and untouched landscape is incredibly wild, dense, and lush. I'm a keen endurance cyclist, and I take full advantage of the trail network in the forest surrounding my area. I work long hours, so most of my winter rides are in complete darkness with my trusty trail light. One section of my home trail winds through a rainforest bog full of trees hundreds of feet tall. It's absolutely beautiful in the daytime. It feels like a magical place with shafts of sunlight piercing through the fog. Hundreds of different species of flora and fauna, and so many wild animals coming and going along game trails. At night, my gut starts to tighten as the thought of passing through this mile-long section of trail. One day, about a year ago, I was lucky enough to get a chance for a day ride, so I took it. It was a cold and very rainy winter day, with very few people out on the trail. I had packed thermos of hot coffee in my backpack, and I thought the forest bog was as good a place as any to have a break, to stretch my legs and drink my coffee. I have an interest in botany, so I was looking closely at the lichens growing on a huge Douglas fir. Suddenly, I felt distinctly not alone. No biggie, lots of people use this trail, although not so many were out that day because the weather was so wet and cold. Then I heard it. A meow. That's odd. This isn't a good place for a cat to be out alone. We have lots of cougars and bears. Then I heard it again. Except it was weird sounding, almost like a robotic sound, like someone was playing a bad audio file of a cat. My gut started to clench. It sounded wrong somehow, and I couldn't figure out why. My hands were shaking when I unzipped my backpack to put my coffee thermos back in. I felt waves of nausea roll over me as the air suddenly felt strangely dense and thick. I was in a rainforest surrounded by trees and moss, but I felt like I couldn't get enough oxygen. I hadn't seen anyone for at least 10 miles, and I was distinctly aware of how far I was from anyone and how my phone didn't get reception here. Then I heard it again, louder and closer and even more wrong. But this was like no cat I've ever heard. It sounded like an imitation of a cat or a person saying meow. It was somehow also tiny, cold and robotic. Right, it was time to leave. As soon as I got out of the bog, I rode the rest of the way home like a bat out of hell, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. There was nothing there that I could see. I will never forget this experience for as long as I live. I've had some pretty disturbing things happen on my night forest rides, but nothing has ever spooked me like that strange and wrong meowing in the middle of the afternoon. I live in a small hick town, which I'm not going to name for the sake of anonymity. You could call me a park ranger, but in a small town of 2,500 people, there isn't much to do. The park I patrolled was bigger than the damn town itself. I was doing my routine patrol around the park. Nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was mostly quiet, until I hit the trails and saw my co-worker, which was strange because we start on opposite sides of the park and meet in the middle. I called his name, but he didn't answer. I figured he just didn't hear me, so I proceeded to get closer to him while saying his name, and I still received no answer. When I got to my co-worker, I punched him on the shoulder in typical guy fashion. He was just sitting there, not saying a single word. I positioned myself so I could see his face. He's staring at a tree right in front of him. Naturally, I grab my flashlight and start to look around the tree. Once I'm around the tree, I see a decent-sized hole in the ground. I shine my flashlight in the hole and begin to understand why my co-worker was acting so strange. There was a bear and 2 little Mexican boys. They had passed away. I quit later that week, as any sane person would. I never heard from my co-worker again, and word around the town says the boys weren't from around here. The newspapers said that the cause of their passing was unknown, and the bear was only wandering and he came across some food. I personally think that someone had done something horrific. The hole they were in was freshly dug, and their bodies were fresh. I still have very vivid nightmares of my co-worker's eyes and the lifeless bodies of those 2 little boys. This happened a few years ago, while I was still in high school, and live feed cameras, door-ring cameras, were first becoming a thing. Must have been about 2014. I used to go running in the woods right by my house in upstate Washington. The trail began very steep, almost like a hike, and then became more flat and steady. That's where I would begin my runs. I would run every day roughly around the same time in the morning, roughly dawn, and the afternoon, before and after school. I was running before school one morning, and a tall man with a beard and a plain tan hat was sitting on the bench at the beginning of the trail. I hated dealing with people because I was an awkward teenager, so I began to look at the ground and just walk by him. As I got closer, I could tell that he was staring at me. I walked past him, and as I was going up the trail, I slightly turned around and saw that he stood up and was walking the trail behind me. Keep in mind the sun is barely coming up, so it's mostly still dark. Then I ran. This was not my normal jog, I was sprinting. No one was ever on this trail in the morning, and I'd never seen him before, and for some reason he creeped me out. I knew I could go through the forest, basically to my backyard, so I wasn't that worried, but I was afraid he was going to attack me or something. As I got further down the trail, I lost him, so I slowed down because frankly I was out of breath. Then I heard a man's voice say loudly, "Well, aren't you going to introduce yourself?" That's when I lost it. I called my mum and told her I thought someone was following me on the trail. I told her a brief version of what happened, and she instructed me that she could meet me with her car at the head of the trail just in case the man was following me. She didn't want him to know where we lived. I went down a side trail that cut short to the head of the trail and was looking out for the man the whole time. I jumped into my mum's car and started crying. I didn't remember why. I just remember being so afraid that I was going to be taken. The rest of my day went normally. I went to school, went to all my classes, and for the most part forgot about the ordeal. The rest of the week was normal, until Friday night on my way home from school. I stopped at the grocery store, and on the way out I swore I saw the man. I thought I was imagining it, so I walked to my car and drove home. I did not do much on weekends. I stayed home, chilled with my family, smoked with my friends, and that was about it. I was up late with my friend Josh, watching bad movie after bad movie, and then we started to hear a knocking on the window at around 3 a.m. I had some annoying middle school kids in my neighborhood who were always pulling pranks. So although it was creepy, being the macho kids we were, we ignored it and tried playing it off like we were ignoring the annoying middle schoolers. The knocking then transferred from the back room we were in to the windows by the front door. In the morning I told my parents and my dad checked the Ring camera. It was the man. There was a multitude of clips of him. First, a couple of him walking past the cameras as he was walking back and forth in front of the house to see if he could see inside. Then a few clips of him stepping back and looking up, as if he was trying to look into the upstairs window from afar. These clips ended at 1:45 in the morning. Then around 3 to 3:05 a.m., he showed up again and he was tapping the window, and we could see him in the camera. At one point he stood back and realized the camera and just stared at it. He did this a few times, and then at one point got really close to it and whispered something like, "How was your run?" He smiled and walked away. My dad called the police and had them come to our house. He showed them the camera footage, but since we didn't have cameras in our house or the back, we could not prove he was trespassing, and there's nothing illegal about talking to someone's doorbell. I never saw him again, and when the police checked back in the following month, they said they thought that once he saw the camera he freaked out and decided he was caught and to stop whatever he was planning to do. It was just totally horrifying. I was literally being stalked. I'm a guy, so something like this has never happened to me, and thankfully hasn't happened since. Safe to say, after these events, I got a gym membership. As a law enforcement ranger for 30 seasons, I've seen some dumb stuff in the woods and some scary stuff. My worst was chasing down a guy who had escaped from a mental treatment facility. If he was just camping in the deep woods, I wouldn't have had an issue with him. But he was routinely stealing the gussets of women and girls' swimsuits, left to dry on lines in campgrounds and Girl Scout areas. The gusset, I'm told, is the cotton part of a suit that touches the outer labia and skin. It's like a soft cotton cloth sewn in for hygienic reasons, I'm told. One of the Girl Scout mums came running up to me as I was on patrol and told me she had seen the man run off on foot from the clothesline, so I gave chase. This was in the days before our handheld radios could transmit further than back to the truck, so I had one of those older girls go and make notifications to my office, and like a dummy, I took off running on the horse trail where I would see fresh prints. I ran 2 miles or so and found a makeshift tent and campground set up. I also found cord and a linoleum knife and tape along with Ziploc gallon-sized bags of these gussets. Clearly our thief was heading in a new direction. I'm convinced my intervention prevented a taking. My guy came out of the woods and I drew my service sidearm for our walk back. I had him handcuffed and in leg irons with a lead drag so I could trip him by stepping on it. I also made him sing the Star-Spangled Banner as we ran to keep him out of breath if he decided to fight. When you're that far in the woods and unsure if you have help coming, you need every advantage. My backup met us on the trail, and we were able to handcuff our prisoner to the bed of the pickup for the ride to the office. I had to sit in the bed with him for the trip. He wasn't much of a chatter. The guys went back to clean out the site. He'd been there for a while, and was definitely a bit of a time bomb. We didn't pursue anything criminal, but he was committed someplace in Ulster County, at a max security psych facility, until his passing. I used to put money on his commissionary every now and again, but I doubt he remembered me. You can't hold a mentally disabled person accountable for stuff they do. If he got a few Snicker bars or some socks to make his life feel a tad more bearable, so be it. He was away from anyone he could hurt, and receiving treatment can't punish him more. My wife also found the notebook that the original story was in. I used to keep notes for court to refresh my memory. At the time that this occurred, the guy was 28 and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and bipolar. He'd been released from a mental health hospital lockdown with the promise he would take his meds. 230 swimsuits and panty gussets were recovered, and a few training bras. He seemed to prefer small or young females. I had forgotten that he ended the life of a deer and a goose via wire traps and then bludgeoned them with rocks. At the time I carried a Smith & Wesson 6.86 revolver in .357 Magnum with 158 GR hollow points. I didn't have a vest, just a t-shirt and button-down shirt, so not much protection from his weapon in the thick pines. This happened during the summer of 2008. For context, I'm a gay male, and at the time, I was in a relationship. Mark was my boyfriend. He was 35 and I was 30. It was July 4th weekend, and my boyfriend wanted to go camping, as he always has every July 4th, usually going with his ex-wife and son who's 7. However, since he is now out the closet, he wanted to take me with him. A little bit about me. I am definitely not an outdoors kind of person. I don't like dirt, I don't like bugs or wild animals, and the thought of not having running water or a roof over my head terrifies me. Yeah, I know I'm spoiled rotten. And as reluctant as I was, Mark persuaded me to go, and reassured me this would be a weekend to remember. Well, he didn't know how right he was yet. He told me we would be leaving Friday morning, which was the 4th, and would come back Monday morning. As we both lived in San Jose, California, the nearest place to camp would be the Santa Cruz Mountains near Felton and the Big Basin Boulder Creek vicinity. We were going to go off-map in a more secluded area to experience nature and less people. We headed out Friday morning at 7 a.m. It was about a 45-minute to an hour drive on the car ride there, and Mark told me that there were people that supposedly lived in the mountains. The first thought that popped into my head was wrong turn and the hills have eyes. I told him that, and he chuckled and said there are some similarities. He explained in great detail that these people were uncivilized, not socialized, and unlike the rest of us in society, and could possibly be dangerous if we encountered them. He went on to tell me they basically live like cavemen and are inbred. He even told me, though he's never come across one, he knows they exist, and he has been told by his brother. Having heard this, I flipped and told him it's a good thing that you just sprung this on me now, because you and I both know I wouldn't have come along knowing this information. He explained that he was just letting me know, not to frighten me, but to inform me of anything should something happen. But, as he guaranteed it, nothing was apparently going to happen. Anyway, we obviously didn't have any way of knowing that. I came prepared, he said, and he said that if he didn't believe me, to open the glove compartment. So I did, and I noticed a leather case. Fearing what I already suspected it was, I opened it before my eyes, and of course was met with a firearm. I don't even know what kind, all I knew is what it was. "This is your guarantee, I suppose," I said to him. "Yes, you must have known on some level that I wouldn't have taken us out to the middle of nowhere and not have protection," he replied. In the back of my mind, he was right, but it didn't stop me from feeling uncomfortable. We reached our destination. Not too long after that, all around me was just nature. Trees, branches, rocks, and boulders. You could barely see the sky from all the trees blocking the sunlight. We began to unload everything from his Toyota Sequoia, and I was impressed by what he'd brought. A 2-bedroom tent, a king-size airbed, and a portable generator with 3 outlets to run power off. Wow, I think maybe this won't be so bad. He smirked that smirk that I loved. Now that I think about it, it was more of an arrogant smirk. Well, my cell didn't get any service whatsoever, and was basically useless, but I did use it as an MP3 player. Smartphones were just starting to make their way available to us, and I had a Motorola Razr, and I was more than ready for an upgrade. Mark said that we needed the power, as I had to get some work done this weekend, and he pulled out his laptop from the back seat. "What am I supposed to do, go play outside while you're working?" I said. "Don't be like that. I've seen all the books, magazines, and your Nintendo DS. You obviously have plenty to occupy yourself with," he replied. He was right. Anyway. Friday night, Saturday, and Sunday were uneventful. We took hikes, made campfires, took naps, relaxed, barbecued, and I did actually enjoy myself. That is until Sunday night. We were in bed. Marcos was asleep, and I was reading R.L. Stine, Fear Street books. I absolutely loved those books. That's when I heard something in the distance. Now, I was kind of used to the little noises of animals like chipmunks and squirrels running around through the leaves, but this sounded more distinct. Footsteps, not that of a four-legged animal. It sounded more like a human, someone who was trying to walk as quietly as possible. I thought it must just be my imagination from reading this book. I set the book down and started to strain to hear more. Closer. Whatever it was getting closer. A bear, perhaps? I look over at Marcos, who was still asleep. Contemplating on what to do, the footsteps reached the tent. Right above our heads was a zipper screen window that we had zipped closed, and was where whatever it was outside had stopped. I held my breath. All I could hear was my rapidly beating heartbeat. I heard someone else breathing. Not Mark. Whoever was outside. I wanted to wake him, but I knew that if I did, he'd make a noise and alert whoever was out there that we were awake. That was when I heard a click. I know that sound. It's the same sound as when I opened my pocket knife. Oh my God, I thought. This is where I'm going to perish. Damn you, Mark. I knew this was a bad idea. That's when I heard a scraping sound running across the tent. I knew what they were going to do, running the knife all around the tent, taunting us. I knew this person had to know one of us was awake, or else why would they be doing that? The sound of the blade went all along the side of the tent and came back around to where we were. Then started again. It was then that I nudged Mark to wake up, and I whispered, "Mark." He started to groan. "Shh," I said. "There's someone outside." I couldn't see his face or anything for that matter because I had turned off the reading light. "There's someone outside. Look." I then saw a flashlight shining on the tent. Mark reached over the side of the bed, grabbed his case, and pulled out that revolver. He yelled, "Stop. Whoever is out there, I'm armed and will not hesitate to shoot you. Leave now, or I will." The flashlight switched off, and whoever it was started to walk away. Not even at a speed walk, just casually walking away without any light. Bear in mind it's pitch black out there. Mark held on to that weapon as I lay there in horror. We didn't say a word. We were just listening for sounds. Somehow, after all that chaos, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke up to Mark shouting my name to come outside. I rubbed my eyes and looked at my watch. It was 6:15 a.m., and it was already light out. I darted up and ran outside to see what he was yelling about. I ran to him to see him kneeling down by his tires, slashed. I looked at the other ones. They too were slashed. The driver's side and passenger window had been shattered. "What the hell?" I shouted. "What are we going to do?" Mark grabbed my hand and said we're going to walk back to the main highway as fast as we can before whoever did this returned. My wallet. I need my wallet and my keys and my phone. My phone was still in the tent inside my bag. I rushed over to the tent, grabbed my messenger bag, realizing my wallet and keys were in the glove box. Oh crap, the glove box. I ran over to the Toyota, swung open the door to notice the glove box was torn open, and everything gone. I started to cry. Realizing this situation was too much for me to deal with, my heart sank into my stomach and my knees got weak. I felt like I was going to faint. "Mark, they have my driver's license, my house keys, my money and my bank cards." "Crap," Mark yelled. "Well, we better go. It's only about 1.5 miles to the highway. We're gonna have to flag someone down or find a call box since my phone is dead." Weak and scared, I started walking with him down the dirt road we drove by just a few days prior. As we walked, I could sense there was someone or something else near us. I had that feeling of being watched. Oh no, I thought. Please just let us get out of here in one piece. Mark stopped me in my tracks, put his finger up to my lips, and said, "Stop. I don't think we're alone. I can hear leaves crunching. Just keep moving. And know what I told you on the way here. I mean it. I'll do whatever I have to protect us." Speed walking got me tired and thirsty. Then I could hear cars in the distance. We were almost there. It was just a little further. Finally reaching the highway, I pulled out my phone, and I had signal. Not much battery, but just enough to call the police, and Mark called the police. They were there in 5 minutes. 2 patrol cars arrived and Mark explained everything while I sat on the curb. I was questioned about the events and said all my identification and cards were stolen and my house and car keys. The officer told me to cancel all those cards immediately and have my house locks changed ASAP. He suggested I also have the vehicle locks changed as well. 2 or more officers arrived, taking Mark and I back to the camp. I didn't really want to go, but having the police with us, I felt like I was somewhat safe. Mark had called his insurance, and I was expecting a tow truck there soon. When we arrived, 3 of the officers looked around, took pictures, questioned us some more, and sealed off the area with yellow tape, which made it look like a crime scene, which I guess it was, as a crime did take place. The officers asked Mark if we had any idea who this could be. I said no, and furthermore I didn't tell anyone beside my mother and best friend that I was coming, but didn't say where. Mark said he only told his ex-wife, who was at home with their son. I thought maybe her, because she obviously didn't like me, and the feeling was mutual. I brushed that thought off out of my mind though, because it was almost impossible for her to pull it off. Also, Mark and I got together way after they were divorced. It wasn't like I broke them up and turned him out. All her rage at him was then directed at me, but she doesn't scare me. In any case, an officer explained to us it was most likely an isolated incident, and that it could have been someone who most likely didn't agree with our lifestyle. Big surprise. I thought that this was a bit extreme, but didn't really buy into that load of crap the officer was telling us. It seems like he was a bit more clued on that he wanted to let us know. "So what's going to happen now?" I said, and the officer said that they'll have to take the information and report the investigation. And if anything comes up, they'll let us know, and that we may need to testify against culprits. Basically, the officer wasn't much help. He couldn't give us much information as to who did this or why it happened. 10 minutes later, the tow truck arrived and we gathered around all our belongings. I was confused that nothing in the tent was stolen, not even Mark's laptop. Now, if I let my imagination run wild, I could think of other things that didn't make sense, but I don't want to go down that path. On the way back to the city, I was in so much disbelief. I wanted to tell Mark, "See, I told you so," but he looked just as hurt and confused as I did, and I couldn't put it past me to do that. I got home, cancelled everything, had my mum call the locksmith and changed all the house locks. I made an appointment for my car to get all those locks changed, and it was tense knowing that someone knew where I lived and could potentially steal my car. Even though they couldn't unlock my house door, that wouldn't stop them from trying to break in. In the end, nothing ever came of the situation, or if it did, Mark never informed me. We spoke about it and he was constantly checking in with the police department. He bought a new SUV. He didn't want anything to remember that weekend. We broke up a few months after for other reasons. I've always wondered if he ever went camping again after that weekend. As for me, it's been 12 years since. I now live in a different state where people do camp a lot, and that's great for them. But I haven't camped since, and probably never will. I used to live on a farm when I was 9 years old. In fact, it was an old schoolhouse that was about 10 kilometers away from our neighbours, with lots of trees across the country and over half an hour from town. Being a kid on a farm with lots of room, I was always exploring the bush or being out with horses and cows. We had chickens, pigeons, rabbit, peafowl, pigs, pheasants, turkeys, geese, and many other birds. I was on my way to go find the horse this day. I was always with Tony, our lead horse. She was a white horse with a black mane and tail. She was more of a foster mother to me, and I could do things with her that would just be amazing. Tony and I had a very close bond. I would climb up her tail and nap on her back as she just grazed. I would climb up her neck, since she was a tall horse for a 9-year-old, even cling and run just around her legs. I would hide under her when I was near her and it started to rain, just as a foal would do. We used to play tag, hide and seek, and so many other games. She loved playing. This is why I was on my way to see her this day. I wanted to be with my best friend. Before you say little kids should not be outside without supervision, this was very common for me since I even slept outside with the animals that I loved and helped care for. I was raised if you are quiet, you will see things you'll normally miss. I always remained quiet to see the wildlife. I can't remember where our German Shepherd was, but it wasn't with me on this particular trip. When I started my trip, I knew I was probably in for a long walk, since she was likely on the other side of the property and across the lake. I crossed the pasture closest to the house, finding nests, interesting rocks, crossing the pasture to the tree line, and it took me about 15 minutes, listening to what kind of birds had what kind of song, and what kind of animal may have crossed through. You can always find out what kind of things are going on around you if you pay attention. As I entered the tree line, things went quiet, so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat. I didn't think much of this since I probably disturbed the wildlife. No birds sang or put up a fuss as I got closer to them. There was no breeze, and the air was very still. It felt thick, and since I was 9 years old, I just thought it was the morning dew evaporating. Most of the trees in this bush were maple or fir. I knew there was a hawk nest nearby, as well as a fox den in a ditch about 10 steps to the right. We had become aware of this problem as some of these foxes had taken some of our chickens, but I was never mad since our hens always had babies each spring. I understood that even they had to eat, and they would only come to human areas if there was no other food source. Things were silent, not a bird or fox bark. I checked on the Robinson's nest to see if they were all right. As I peeked into the nest, the babies were awake, but very silent and didn't move nor blink their eyes. I moved back onto the cow trail and got the feeling that something wasn't right. No birds, no animals, not even a sound of my footfalls on the path. I moved very slowly towards the meadow that was about 500 meters from where the tree line started. It was very slow and very quiet. Halfway through the bush, I smelt it. Rotting flesh mixed with skunk, and a really bad smell of death. It's amazing how fast your senses will get used to a smell and you go noseblind. I looked around and didn't see anything, no movement, so I kept going, hoping to get through this smell. As I got to the exit of the trees, there is a meadow that always have deer, but this day I got more than I bargained for. I heard grunting and growling mixed with really rough voices, and someone had a really bad sore throat. I couldn't make out the words as I was still too far to understand. I stopped to listen as I could hear snarling, growling of some kind of big animal. It didn't sound like a bear or even a moose grunting. I laid down on the ground thinking I could sneak up and see what kind of animal was making this sound. I peeked through the trees and into the meadow, and I saw something, but I didn't know what it was. I saw 3 creatures that almost looked like really big deer, with their flesh rotting off in batches. I could see ribs and bones, as if the flesh was missing. Other parts were like brown hair mixed with a really bad case of mange. The big one had large antlers with many points. There was skin or something that was shedding off the antlers, and waved or fell off in pieces as it moved. Long ears like a donkey's. This side of its face had no skin at all, and was bare, yellowish bone. It was standing on its hind quarters, as if it were a human with a bit of a hunch. This one was doing the most grunting and growling. It was watching the two smaller ones and randomly pointed with its hands. It had hands, with long claws like talons. The hair this one had on its body was black. The skin was dark brown. This one was circling the other two slowly. I was expecting this one to join in the attacks. The hind legs were that of a big dog, but had hooves. I was not close enough to see the eyes, but I didn't want to approach it anymore. The smaller, darker one had a smaller set of antlers like a young deer, 8 points at least, but this one was a lot meaner to the smaller of the three. Its body was lean, and it was quick. It moved in flashes, and when it paused, it took swipes and bites at the smallest. It was trying to use its hands with long claws and teeth, trying to attack the smaller brown one. I saw chunks of flesh being ripped off the smallest one who couldn't fight back, as well as the other two. Its hands and claws were dripping with blood, and flesh hung from its claws in chunks. The smallest of the three was brown with 3-point antlers. Only one. Its flesh was bleeding profusely from its wounds. It snarled and bared its teeth while trying to fend off the attacks. There were broken bones hanging out the flesh. The blood was so bright against its hair and skin, I could see it dripping from where the missing antler was ripped out or broken in the fight. This was not upright like the other two. This one was on all fours, low to the ground, and having trouble trying to get a powerful kick into the attacker or a swipe. I saw that its right hind leg had most of the flesh ripped off already and a leg broken. There was bone on the lower leg sticking out and bending awkwardly. There wasn't much time before I knew this was a losing battle. I must have gasped at the sight when the big brown one perked its ears and turned to me. Its eyes narrowed when its gaze focused. The eyes were bright yellow, as if there was a light behind it, almost fluorescent. It didn't take its eye off me when it said in a really rough voice, "Leave. Go." I thought it was talking to me, but I was frozen in fear. I saw the two big ones run off into the trees and vanish, leaving the third behind. I was not going to approach. I was too scared to run. But just as I was about to move, I saw the small one lift its head and look at me. It growled and snarled and slowly moved to where I was. I froze. I couldn't even move. I even held my breath. I saw this creature moving for me and I couldn't move. I could see its breath now, and instead of white steam, it was pink from all the blood. Hearing a horse calling out, I looked to my right and saw our horses running towards me. My horse, with her head down in attack mode. Her nostrils flared, and she was almost screaming out. Everything went silent for a moment. Her calls were so loud they echoed in my head. I wasn't sure if my life was going to be ended by my beloved horse, or this creature heading for me out in the open. I felt doom and danger and fear. I dropped flat to the ground and called out for our horse with the herd in tow. I've never seen them run so fast. The sound of their hooves pounding the ground, which sounded hollow at this point. I saw our horses herd, about 8 horses in all, heading straight for the thing. They attacked it. The first one to reach the creature reared up, and the others surrounded it in a half circle, almost blocking my view. But I could see between the consistent moving legs, the creature stand up, snarl, and snap at them. I turned my head to the lead horse, Tony, and she came running with her head down and slowed to stand next to me, gently comforting me. I stared where I was as I saw the horse herd drive it away. They stayed on attack until the things were out of sight. I hugged Tony's leg as I couldn't stand from fear. I saw her lift her head to call the herd. I was shaking so badly and breathing heavily. I thanked her for saving my life. She let me take my time to calm down, and I didn't let go of her. When I was able to stand, she guided me home, as I'd seen the other horses putting up a fuss, bucking and prancing, tossing their heads around as they ran back to their leader. I was scared of what was in the woods. It wasn't until I was home to ask my mum what the creature was that I'd seen. I described it to her as much as possible, and I was told deer or elk, and not to talk of it again. The next day after school, I went out to the same meadow. I'm a sucker for punishment, I know. I had to see for myself what really had happened, and I saw the blood-stained grass and dirt from where the fight had taken place. Fast forward to adulthood. I'm watching movies and hearing stories on YouTube, and that's when it clicks. I realized what I had seen and what could have happened to me when I was 9 years old if the horses hadn't saved my life. It's still creepy to recall this, knowing that these creatures were less than 5 kilometers from our home. Ever since I was young, I loved working in the outdoors. It was my favorite thing to do. So when I signed up to be a park ranger, it was the perfect fit. I've had a number of strange things happen to me on the job, most of which aren't even worth mentioning. Just small things like apparitions or feeling someone behind my back, turning around and no one there. But there's one experience that I don't think will ever leave my mind. This happened in the little ranger cabin, where I used to spend a fair bit of my time, writing reports and doing this, that and the other, when I wasn't out walking and protecting the trails. I was there one evening, just as it was getting dark, and I heard a noise on the radio. I assume it's my partner who's out checking, and when I listen, the sound is all static and muffled. I ask if everything's alright and wait for a response. After a few minutes, I start getting worried. Is he okay? I know there's no cell service here, but I try him anyway. He didn't get my message, and he didn't answer my call, not that it went through. So I try the radio one more time, but it's dead. About 45 minutes pass at this point with no news, and my partner should have been back by now. But I give it another half hour just in case. I don't want to be overreactive. And when he hadn't come back, it was well and truly dark. I start getting scared. So I go out to explore. The area we have to cover, by all means, isn't that large. We have a few routes that we have to check on, and I go and investigate the one that he was scheduled to do. I take my vehicle and away I go. I'm strolling through the trails looking around, and I can't see any sign of him. Just as I'm about to get to halfway point, passing a river, do I hear something? It's the buzzing of my radio. It almost sounds like static. I push the button and listen. There he is on the other line. It's sort of like he's far away or underwater. It's hard to describe it. Hello, is everything alright? There's nothing. It's gone dead again. This is really giving me chills. And after 5 more minutes of driving, do I see his vehicle on the other side of the road. I stop, jump out, turn on my flashlight and have a look around. I see a trail not too far that I'm quite confident he's walked down. It's one that I personally have never explored, and it's giving me the creeps. This is one of the few times that I've started to feel uncomfortable in the woods. The dread, not knowing if an animal has got to him, or perhaps a person with a dark motive. I approach with trepidation, looking around, checking my surroundings and listening for noises as I get closer to where I hope my buddy's at. Just as I'm about to enter a little clearing, do I see his radio on the floor. I give a little, "What the?" and when I go to pick it up, I hear someone behind me. Boo! I turn around, but no one's there. I stumble back in fear, fall flat on my butt, and turn around in a panic. I look around, moonlight coming through the clearing. I don't see anyone, and I book it back to my vehicle. I trip halfway through and land with my hand facing down on my radio and shatter it to pieces. I leave the bits discarded and run for my life. I feel a dark presence behind me as I run back to my vehicle. I sit there in what I feel like is a protected space, just hoping that this is safe enough, as I don't think I have the willpower to move just yet. After a few minutes, I've calmed down enough and ask myself if I had just imagined that or it really happened. I try and throw water over my face, blink a few times and tell myself it must all be in my head. I'd recovered my friend's radio, which had his name written on the side in Sharpie, but mine was still scattered all over there. Littering is of course a big no-no where we work, so I know that I'm going to have to come back and get it. Should I go now? Or should I do it later, I wonder? I'm so scared that I think perhaps it would be best to do it later. But my body's vehicle is still right in front. Torn, confused and scared, I tell myself that I'll just wait a little bit and see if he gets back. 40 minutes pass, and he doesn't. So with his radio next to me, do I start making my way back to the clearing to look around? I get there, see the shattered pieces, and the feeling of ominous darkness is gone. I gather them up in a little baggie that I conveniently had with me, and make my way around the clearing shouting his name. "Paul?" No reply. After about 20 minutes, I'm starting to get anxious. Maybe I should call for help. And that's when I see him. He's on the floor, face down in the dirt, not too far from the tree line. I run over to him. I'm so glad he was wearing the little reflectors on his jacket, as my light caught them just as I was about to leave. I ask him what he's doing face down in the dirt, and after giving him a few hearty pokes, does he finally make a noise and return to consciousness. He told me that he thought he heard someone, like laughter, children's laughter, so he stopped and went into the clearing to investigate. But when he got to the middle, he passed out and he remembers nothing else. Confused and severely weirded out, we shine our flashlights in every direction as we make our way back to our vehicles and get the hell out of there. That was one of the strangest experiences we ever had on the job. Thankfully, nothing else weird ever happened, not in the last few years I worked there, but it's always left me wondering, what the hell did I hear? And was it even real, or all in my head? This happened quite recently. Today, we planned on going on a 4-mile hike. The trail makes a big loop, with the beginning point also acting as the ending point. The story begins in the trail parking lot. There were about 5 other cars in the lot, and out of the car nearest us came a middle-aged couple. We paid them no mind, as we typically do with strangers, and we headed off to the restroom before hitting the trail. They set off on their own hike. When we started to hike, we chose route number 1, doing the loop counterclockwise. The trail itself makes a huge loop, about 4 miles in length, with the parking lot being at the highest elevation, and the lowest point being the middle of the trail. The ascent from the bottom middle section to the top going in either direction is extremely steep, slow, slippery, and tough. About 20 minutes into our overall 3-hour hike, we reached point A, where we caught up with the older couple. About the time we caught up to them in the canyon, they decided to turn back towards the parking lot, passing us along the way. We exchanged smiles and waved as we passed, and again thought nothing of it. From point A to point B, everything seemed totally normal. We were hot and tired, of course, but were enjoying ourselves and thought very little about the other couple. When we reached point B, about 2/3 of the way through the loop, just starting the uphill climb back towards the parking lot. However, things started to get a little weird. As soon as we exited the low-lying canyon region, we saw the same couple heading towards us, as if they had returned to the parking lot and opted instead for Route 2. We still didn't find this completely out of the ordinary, as the first canyon around point A was tough to get down, and it seemed that they were somewhat unprepared. The woman was wearing a knee-length skirt, which is a bad choice for slippery canyon slopes and climbing steep rocky bluffs, and it appeared they had not brought a pack with water or anything. We passed them again, exchanged pleasantries and continued on. This time though, we did talk briefly about the situation. We found it odd that they made it far enough to meet us at this point, as the first parts of routes 1 and 2 were steep and slow, and the area between point A and B was pretty flat and steady. Considering the difference in terrain and their age/apparent physical conditions, we agreed it was awfully strange to see them at that point on the trail, but we continued anyway, just shrugging it off and thinking nothing more about it. Soon afterwards, we made our way to the outlook, which was a few hundred feet above the bottom section of the trail, and 10 minutes past point B. As we paused to take some pictures and catch our breath, my wife pointed out that she could hear their voices down below in the canyon as we rested. We listened, and mutually agreed that it was probably the same couple, since the point the voices seemed to come from would be about the right spot for them, given the last location we saw them at, and the lack of anyone else on the trail so far. Still nothing too strange yet. That is until we reached point C. Between the outlook and point C, which was 20 minutes from the end of the loop and 40 minutes past point B, was a wide gravel trail with steep drop-offs on either side. You could say it was a sort of ridge, as everything within the loop made a giant lopsided bowl, much like a volcano, with the elevation difference between the lowest point of the trail and the highest point of the trail being about 500 feet. This made the terrain around the trail seem pretty much impassable. It was extremely steep and covered in thick undergrowth and fallen trees. It seemed to be pretty much a given that the established trail is the only way to get from the outlook back to the parking lot. As we neared point C, we were becoming increasingly exhausted and ready to be done. We stopped once or twice for about 30 seconds apiece to catch our breath, and as we got closer and closer to point C, it was as if the energy was sucked out of both of us. Of course, the trail was tough, but we had done it and many like it before, and it wasn't even 80 degrees outside. Even as our mental focus began to waver, and we started noticing a significant change in our demeanor and attitude, we still marched on, knowing the end of the trail was near. When we reached point C, everything changed for the worse. Now keep in mind we saw the older couple about 40 minutes earlier past point B, and there was no way to reach point C from there except the trail that we were currently on. There were no shortcuts, there was no realistic way to pass us without us knowing, and no way to possibly beat us there. And yet there they were, sitting on a bench on the side of the trail eating lunch. As we passed them, the man mentioned something about a picnic to us and smiled, laughing. We tried our best, responding kind, but the mood was as if we had just walked into a giant black cloud of smoke. I'm not really sure how to explain it, but the area around them disoriented us completely, and we were no doubt as pale as ghosts and obviously shaken. It wasn't a malevolent feeling, and they didn't seem aggressive or strange, but our brains were just shocked into a state of horror in seeing them there. It just wasn't possible. We passed on by them, and as soon as we were out of earshot, my wife turned to me with a face I had never seen before in my life. We were terrified. Without saying a word to each other, we both experienced the same feeling of shock. It felt as if we had just walked through a time warp or brushed against another dimension. Our following discussion amounted to this, that there was no way they could have beaten us there. Sure, maybe, possibly, just maybe there was a chance, but only if after seeing us at point B they sprinted through the woods in a direct line towards point C. Now this would require them to run up steep rock bluffs, through unmarked woods, and who knows whatever else for over a mile. In 40 minutes. That's how long it took us to get there, going at a pretty good speed, clearing our usual trail, which, as crows fly, was not that much longer than a direct route between B and C. We were in our early 20s and in decent shape, and we were dead tired by the time we saw them. And based on their apparent level of preparedness and fitness, there's no way, even if they did take a direct off-trail route, they could have made it there before us. On top of that, they had somehow found 2 Bud Lights and a lunchbox full of sandwiches on the way, and were almost already done eating them by the time we met them at point C. All of these things combined with the overwhelming feeling we got when we encountered them at point C have left us in mental shambles for the past few hours. We have no idea what to make of this, and no clue how to explain it in a way that even begins to make sense. So, weird hikers, I hope not to encounter you again. The stories I'm about to share with you happened at the same Boy Scout camp. They were some years apart, and I don't think they have anything to do with each other. In any case, I've always felt a little uneasy about that camp, especially while swimming. To be more clear, I felt like I would be pulled underwater at any moment out of nowhere. But my stories have nothing to do with the lake. A friend of mine had bought a large tent with 2 rooms, the rooms situated where you had to go through one to get out the other. My friend who owned the tent and another friend set their cots and stuff up in the front room. I set mine up in the back alone. It had been a few days in, and things were for the most part going smoothly, earning merit badges and swimming. But that night, I won't forget for a second, it was late, and everyone went to bed. I had gone outside the tent to go to the bathroom. The camp had these bugs that like to make a lot of noise at night. But 2 minutes after I got back in and laid on my cot, they stopped, and it was dead silent, and that's when I heard it. It sounded like a snort, not like a pig or anything, like a predator. I also began to hear whatever it was walk, and it sounded huge and bipedal. It stopped around the tent and began to move further into the center of our campsite, and continued stomping and snorting. All I could do was listen in fear, hoping it didn't get the incentive to rip into the tent. Then it stopped, and the sound of the bugs returned. I never did go out to find out what it was. All I did was lay there and hope it didn't return. Next morning I told my troop, and when I did everyone laughed at me, and my scoutmasters made it worse by telling me I had a wild imagination. The other friends I shared the tent with believed me though. One said it could have been a raccoon, but I've heard raccoons before, and it doesn't sound like what I've heard. My second story took place while I was staff. I was much older, and being on staff can be much more fun and relaxing compared to being a camper. Less rules, you don't get told what to do, and you get to stay out there longer and have a week to yourself with your own campsite and pre-built tent platforms in a row. That said, it comes with its downsides too. This time you're the one who teaches the merit badges, and you now know why some staff don't get along that well with the kids. We'd been a few weeks into the camp, and one night I had decided to go to the parking lot, relieve some stress and smoke a cigar, as the parking lot was the designated smoking area. Now, I'm not great at measurements. Imagine a really large gravel parking lot with 4 woods on each side and a road in the right corner leading away from camp. Before you get to the parking lot, there's a wall with a gate for cars. I decide to sit up against the wall in the parking lot alone. It was windy and I had trouble getting the cigar lit when I got the odd feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the tree line when I saw it to the left. Behind a few trees was an odd red light. It wasn't large enough to illuminate anything large because the area was quite dark. It looked red like the numbers on an alarm clock, but it was brighter too. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the light on a power pole or something, so I continued trying to light my cigar. When it got lit, I felt a little relieved, but the feeling of being watched did not go away. I scanned the tree line again, but didn't find anything of interest. I stared at that red light for a few moments, and that's when it hit me. There was nothing in that direction for light to be there, so I grabbed my things and left. I thought I saw the light move. It didn't seem like a light, more like a sinister eye. When I got to my feet, a feeling that I should run for my life hit me so hard, and I bolted, over the wall and across the camp. It's not like anyone was up. No one was going to slow me down or help me out. I headed for the cafeteria, which was the largest building, because I knew the lights would be on and the doors would be unlocked. So I went in there and laid down on some chairs to calm down. I threw up in the trash can and a friend walked in and found me there and walked me back to my tent. The next morning I asked the leader in my area if there was anyone over there that would have a red light for any reason and have it turned on at night. To my dismay, he thought it was someone with a red flashlight up to no good. That was my first year on staff. My second year had nothing of note, and I'd never seen or heard anything like that since. And honestly, I certainly hope that nothing like that ever happens again. I am a park ranger. There have been a few occasions where I have actually taken the night shift. Most of the time I wrongfully pass out in the provided bed and wait until my shift ends. This story actually takes place during one of those occasions. I was fast asleep in the bed, even though the mattress was hard and didn't adjust to my back. I had done my sight check and stared at the woods for about a half hour. But time moves on and my attention wavers, so I came up with sleeping as one of my solutions to boredom. In an instant I realized I was awake, and I immediately sat up in the bed. Something had woken me up. It was one of those occasions where something loud happens, but don't process it in time to register what it was. Whatever it was, it must have been loud. Glancing towards my alarm clock, I could see that it was 3:21 a.m. I rubbed my eyes of what little sleepiness was still in me, and looked around to see if maybe something had fallen. Everything seemed to be in place, but these lights were off, and my nocturnal vision is less than supreme. I heard something shut, the tower door. The door was wide open, flapping in the wind. That must have been it. I left the door open a little and a strong gust of wind must have thrown it open and against the wall. I guess it wasn't anything closing after all. The gust of wind was now just going through the room and disturbing my warm temperature. I rolled off my sheets, hopped out of bed towards the door, and I pushed it with some force towards the wall, hoping to recreate the sound and trigger a memory. But the door didn't even fully reach all the way back to the wall, its hinge keeping it firm. I shut the door, fully this time, and went back to my stone-hard sleeping spot. I was able to fall back into a doze fairly quickly, before I was awoken again by what I assumed to be the exact same thing. I still didn't hear it. I looked towards the door and saw that it still remained shut, undisturbed since I last saw it. The alarm clock read 3:39. I had only been asleep for 18 minutes. I grew annoyed at the thought of not being able to fall asleep, and got up to search the kitchen. Being the same kitchen as every other tower, I could easily locate and check off each item I found as not being the culprit. All knives were still in their holder, the microwave was off, blender unplugged, the toaster didn't seem to be the cause, so that meant it probably wasn't an electric thing making the noise. The floor was clean and the cabinets were shut. I was truly clueless, gave up my search and went to sleep. Sat under the covers, still awake, and now in day mode because of all my detective work. Then I heard it. It was a scream. A scream that sounded like a car tire stuck, screeching on asphalt. I was only able to identify it as a vocal product because of the changes in pitch going up and down in its high tone. It sounded inhuman, blood-curdling, and agonizing. I jumped out of bed, tripping on my covers, and looked around. By now the screaming had stopped, but it was so loud that I knew it had to be coming from inside. I looked back to the kitchen. Whatever it was must be there. I looked from the appliances on the counter to the drawers and utensils that were laid out, to the 2 giant cabinets that were at the other end of the kitchen. The office joker Donnie was on vacation in Hawaii. I had seen him post about it earlier that day. There was no one else that worked here, which meant it wasn't a prank. I grabbed one of the sharp objects that sat in the holder and crept my way to the cabinet. I reached one arm into the silver handle, the other poised with the weapon ready to defend myself. I threw open the door and readied myself for an attack that didn't come. I saw nothing in the cabinets beside a broom and other supplies that were above my pay grade. At first at least, until I glanced downwards to the raccoon that was crouched in the corner. It screamed that monstrous scream, and I tripped backwards as it ran over me to safety under my rock of a bed. Even it knew that mattress was unbreakable. I opened the door again and poked at the raccoon with the broom until it finally ran back outside. So maybe I did hear a door shut after all. Poor thing must have been shut in there by the wind. It didn't matter, the noise was gone and I was finally able to go back to sleep. I curled under my blankets and rested my head on the pillow, in serene peace, completely unaware of the horrific banshee that lied just above me on the ceiling. I'm 16 years old and live in the western United States and am active in rodeo. This story happened in late winter. My brother and his close friend Tom got permission from a local reservation to use their arena to practice roping. We got there early in the morning, so we would have all the time we needed. Now mind you, my brother's horse and Tom's are both very even-tempered and don't spook easily. My mare, on the other hand, will panic at the slightest of things, and she can be a handful most of the time, to be honest. Since the moment we got there, all of our horses seemed to be on edge, but we shrugged it off and figured that once they got used to their surroundings that they would be fine. After spending the better part of the day throwing ropes and chasing cattle, we decided to go for a trail ride to explore the area. By now, the horses seemed to have calmed down quite a bit. There is a river that ran close to the arena, so we decided to go down and check that out, as well as some animal tracks that we had seen. Once we got about 30 yards from the water, we could smell what could only be described as a rotting dead animal. Then something in the tree line caught the attention of all the horses, and after that, mine flat out refused to go any further. Being tired from a long day and frustrated from my horse's lack of cooperation, we decided to call it a day. By this time it was too late to load our gear and horses and take them back. so we decided it was just best to leave them there for the night and stay at Tom's, because they lived closer than my brother and I. We got their stalls ready for the night, got them fed and watered, and headed over to one of Tom's family friends who offered to cook us dinner. After some good food, good laughs, and a few games of pool, the weird encounter by the river was out of mind. When 9 o'clock rolled around, we all wanted to get some sleep, but I wanted to check on the horses one last time before we left. But when I mentioned this to Tom's family friend, he warned me to not go there alone at night. Wanting to respect that, Tom offered to drive down with me. We got in the truck and headed back to the arena. It was only a half-mile drive back, but the roads were very icy, so we had to drive slower than what I would have liked. Before crossing the bridge that went over the river, this feeling of dread hit me like a ton of bricks. I looked out the window to be met with glowing yellow eyes. They're hard to describe because there was not enough light hitting them to make them glow the way they did. I'm a very rational person, but something in my gut told me that this was very wrong. That's when Tom turned to me and asked if I smelt that awful smell, which I hadn't even noticed until they said something. When I didn't respond, they looked at me and met my gaze just to see the same yellow eyes, the glare I was fixated on. We were both in terror, not knowing what this thing was because from where it sat, it had to have been at least 8 feet tall, and there are no animals that large in these parts. I finally came to my senses and hit the gas, and our truck started sliding, but we caught traction and made our way back to the arena. When we pulled up, the headlights hit the horses, and the first thing I noticed was that my mare hadn't even touched her food, and that for her is very out of the ordinary. She's kind of a pig and normally eats more than her fair share. The other two hadn't touched their food either, which again was very strange, but being scared and cold, we got back in the truck and drove back without incident. We got to Tom's at about 11, and as soon as our head hit the pillows, we were out like a light bulb. All of a sudden, I woke up to my brother grabbing my arm and shaking me. When I asked him what was wrong, he just put his finger over his mouth and pointed to the window. There was a tapping on the glass and an occasional scratch. I looked at the clock. It was around 3 a.m. Tom and I hadn't told him about our encounter on the bridge, but it was late, and I wasn't going to tell him now and scare him even more. Trying to be rational, I told him just to ignore it and try and get some sleep. But knowing what had happened, I was convinced it was the thing from the reservation, and it had followed us back. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and as soon as the sun came up, I woke up Tom and my brother so that we could get our horses and go home, because I didn't want my poor girl to be out with that thing any longer. I told Tom about the tapping and scratching after coffee, so we went to look by her window for tracks, and sure enough, there were what looked to be deer hooves, but they didn't track like normal deer, almost like they were injured, but that still doesn't quite describe it. It only seemed to be one pair and not two, like it was walking on its hind legs. This spooked us, but we just wanted to go see if our horses were okay, so we headed back to the res. They were all fine, but the food and water was still untouched. We got them loaded up and out of there as quickly as we could. As we drove over that bridge one last time, I looked into the tree line to see a massive buck staring at me. He was large, and I mean unnaturally large, but very sickly looking, like his skin was just falling from his bones, and his legs bent in an odd way. It wasn't the worst part though. It was his face. Those same ungodly yellow eyes. But when I made eye contact, I swear this thing, whatever it was, smiled at me. I looked away and looked back, and it was gone. Perhaps it just wanted to scare us one last time. I still have so many questions from that night, but the only thing I know for sure is that I'm never going back there again. Back in the day, I used to work as a park ranger. We covered an absolutely massive area, which I would like to keep private for the sake of anonymity. To give you a little bit of context, there was a very large cave in one of the areas which we protected. Sometimes if you would throw rocks into the cave, the echoing sound would almost be like a boom. It scared a whole lot of people who came across that area, or people who messed around and tried to play in there. We generally said that that place was unsafe, and put warnings up to let people know it wasn't worth risking your life going in there. Of course, one day we get a call saying that someone had seen someone else go into that cave. They'd waited and they'd never saw them leave. It was starting to get dark, so they told us. Of course, we start making our way in twilight, already quite fearful of whoever's gone into that cave, as we're quite aware that things don't usually end well if you go in there. With our flashlight and ropes at hand, we start investigating and making our way down. The ropes were more of a precautionary measure. I suppose if you knew the cave system quite well, it wouldn't be that difficult to navigate, but it can be treacherous for those who have never stepped foot inside, especially the descent to access the cave itself, with sharp rocks and a few drastic drops where people are bound to get hurt. Just to cut to the future here, we actually had to scoop some guy out who'd fallen down and broken both his legs on the descent. It's quite a deep drop. Just goes to illustrate how foolish some people can be to access an area that's not supposed to be touched. In any case, back to the story. We started delving our way in to see if we could find this kid. We started calling out to him, letting him know that he wasn't in trouble and that we just wanted to help him out, that we had ropes and candy bars if he came with us. There was no reply. The further we went in, the hotter it seemed to be. And after we'd searched for about 40 minutes, seen and heard no one, were we starting to think that perhaps this was a hoax, or someone was just trying to waste our time. It was just around the time that we were searching the final few passages of this cave that one of our partners, called Jimmy, screams out to come this way. We navigate our way over to where he is, and we find the boy huddled in a corner. We ask him why he's in there and if he's okay. We pick him up and start making our way out. This kid, blonde, blue eyes, and about 4'3", must have been absolutely petrified. He was caked in sweat in one of the deepest parts of the cave in the dark. I don't know why he never called out for help. After we'd scooped him up and started making our way out, we put him in the truck and asked him what was wrong as we made our way back to the ranger station. In these situations, it's best not to aggravate or upset someone who's done something wrong, especially a minor, as our job is to try and make them feel comfortable and get them back to safety. We tried our best to probe him the little bit we could, but he was very unresponsive. The person who'd called it in had actually found that kid's parents. They were worried sick. They were all waiting at the ranger station. The mother was so happy to see her son, and she thanked each of us personally. When she started scolding her boy, did I tell her that maybe that wouldn't be the best course of action, as he's in shock and quite upset. She, however, didn't want to hear it from me, and carried on scolding him, until he started wailing, nearly having a breakdown, in front of all 8 of us at the ranger station. Only then did he start to speak about what actually happened. In tears, he said something along the lines of, "Mummy, it's not my fault. The hairy man made me do it. I had to follow him into the cave." We stood there, mouths agape. What did he mean, the hairy man? I interjected, "Son, is there someone in there? Was he trying to hurt you?" He didn't respond to me. I want to go home, Mummy." The mother said that her son was tired and that she wouldn't be having any more questions from us, but thanked us nonetheless and was on her way. I suppose it wasn't our place. But the next day we went back and did a bit more exploring to see if perhaps there was a homeless man who tried to lure the child in. There was nothing. It's still one of the biggest mysteries I've ever had to deal with in this job. What was he talking about? This area is known for Bigfoots, so I'm not discounting that. But why lead him into a cave and then vanish? What on earth could this be? When I was younger, my dad would tell me this story about something that happened to him and my older brother, when my brother was very young. I never had any reason to doubt that this was true, but you know how it is. You remember something from your childhood, and so you dig a little deeper. I independently researched this when I was older, and it is completely true. My aunt had just been physically abused by her husband at the time, and so my older sister, who was an infant at the time, and my mum, pregnant with me, were with her. My brother was around 5 and stayed with my dad, who decided to take him camping on the Appalachian Trail as a special treat. My dad worked in law enforcement at the time, which ties into the story. Where I live, there are multiple roads that access the Appalachian Trail, so my dad took my brother to a portion of the trail that leads to a trail shelter, not more than 2 miles in. When the two of them arrived at the campsite, they decided to leave the shelter vacant and pitch a tent, which is polite to do for through hikers. There was only one other camper near the shelter, which is not that uncommon given how close the shelter was to the road. My dad decided to introduce himself to the other single male camper, mentioning that he works in law enforcement. The guy was clearly off, but as of yet was in no way nefarious towards them. He did, however, have a very large hunting utensil that he left out, clearly visible and very dangerous. As it began to get dark, the other camper began to behave more strangely. He would look over at my dad and brother and stare, as if he had something to say, and then look back. My dad did everything he could to engage the guy in conversation, but again the man just behaved oddly. My dad picked up on this, so decided to pull out his concealed weapon and place it within view. After 2 hours of staring and creeping, the guy approached my dad with a smaller hunting utensil, not threateningly, but as if to give it as a present. My dad naturally looks at this gesture with confusion. The man says, "Hey, take this." "No," my dad says. "No, really, take it." "No." A few more rounds of this back and forth. "I mean it. Take it. You're gonna need it tonight," the guy says, deadpan, locking eyes with my dad. My dad doesn't know what to say, but the guy walks away and leaves it by the ring of fire. My dad has my brother, a younger child, with him and is naturally terrified. He decides that despite it being dark, it's high time to promptly get the hell out of the campsite. So with my brother close by, he packs up the tent, packs up his pack, which takes him about half hour in the dark. My dad is about to leave when the guy sees him. He picks up the hunting utensil, holding it as if to attack, and approaches my dad. My dad has his flashlight pointed directly at the guy, sensing that something was about to go down. "I want you to fight me," the guy growls, locking eyes, with about 10 feet between him and my dad and brother. My dad grabs his firearm, aims it, and basically tells the guy to step down. He tells my brother to grab the pack, which has a seat on it, to hold a young child. My dad puts the pack on. He hands my brother the flashlight and tells him to get on his back. At first he backs up the trail with the weapon trained on the guy, and my brother pointing the flashlight at him. The guy slowly approaches, but then stops just before my dad pulls the trigger. My dad decides he's gonna run, and tells my brother to shine the flashlight on the trail and let him know if he sees anyone following. Clearly dangerous in the near dark on a wooded trail. but it was that, or leave my brother with no flashlight. My dad runs all the way back to the car, hightails it out of there, and goes home to call my mum and put my brother in bed. He also calls the police. The next day, my dad hears that the guy went to a bar after the encounter and started talking about it. He then, oddly enough, went to the cops to say that my dad had assaulted him with a firearm, at which point the police got him for questioning. Upon following up an investigation over a few months, they found out that the guy was bipolar, but wasn't on his meds, and didn't actually mean my dad or brother any harm. When the guy saw the firearm and heard he was in law enforcement, he decided he basically wanted to end his life by cop. My dad went through a lot of counseling for this afterwards, which was always interesting to hear because when you hear these danger stories from people, you never hear about the aftermath. The guy wound up in jail for a short period of time. Anyway, I hope for the best for the guy because I understand that he suffered from mental illness. But still, it's creepy, and I'd rather not meet again. This happened about 5 years ago, when I was in high school. After school, me and 2 friends decided to go to our local bayou and explore the nearby woods. It's not the first time I had ventured into these woods. I actually grew up riding my dirt bike in them. But as we were walking through, we saw a very old-looking entrance to a path in the woods. It was an arch made up of dozens upon dozens of sticks and twigs, and us being young, we decided it would be a good idea to get on our hands and knees and crawl through this sketchy structure. Obviously not the right decision. It could have been a booby trap or something. Luckily it wasn't, and we continued on our adventure into the depths of the forest. After following this path for a short amount of time, we stumbled upon a tent and a wooden structure next to it that created a roof of sorts. We called out to the tent and asked if anyone was there, before deciding that it must be vacant. Since we're troublemakers, I think it's pretty obvious that we raided it next. Tucked in the roof of that wooded structure were machetes, pellet guns, and on the ground trash bags filled with a bunch of random containers and stuff which struck me as sort of strange. It seemed as if someone actually lived there. Inside the tent laid a mattress, and right next to it was a giant bong, and since I was a stoner at the time, I called out dibs as fast as I could. My friend sighed and told me I could keep it. Luckily, the retail value of the thing was about $250, but unfortunately, someone ended up stealing it from me not long after I originally obtained it. There was also some Jack Daniels, some blueberry vodka, which I snatched up too, so I ended with most of it for myself. It was starting to get dark. At the opposite end of this clearing was a trail that was covered in little tea light candles still lit. There must have been hundreds of these things. The trail wasn't very long and ended up leading back to the tent. So it just kind of looped around. But still, you have to be very meticulous to take hundreds of tea lights and lay them out on both sides of the path that was a couple of dozen feet long, and then light them one by one. After that, we decided to get the hell out of there, before some homeless guy came back to find out we snuck through their camp and stole some stuff. Looking back, I think we might have actually stumbled on a makeshift lab. Why else would there be a few trash bags lying around, filled with all sorts of various canisters and containers? I really think whoever lived there was cooking up some shake. I could be wrong though, but all I know is that place was sketchy. I ended up going back a few times even by myself, and it looked like the area had since been abandoned, with the tent and mattress being burnt to the ground. That area looked different in the dark, especially when I was alone. It had an eerie feeling to it, but that's not all. The candles were still lit. Panic spread throughout me, and I ran the hell out of there, never to return again. I was a wildland firefighter back in the day in Arizona. I worked in a forest that was generally populated with a lot of recreation in the northern part, but I worked on the southern portion of the forest that was really remote. It barely had any roads or campgrounds, so if you wanted to recreate there, you had to work for it. The fire crew I was in had 2 duty stations, one in a small town where the rest of the forest employees worked off, and one that was about 2.5 hours away up a really windy mountainous road. The remote duty station had an old Forest Service ranger station and a newer double-wide trailer that was recently put in. When I worked at this place, it had no cell reception. When my crew and I weren't working, they were playing horseshoes or watching movies. They did eventually add a cell phone booster, which sadly made more people play on their phones, but I digress. So, my supervisor from that crew had experienced some weird things working up there. There was one night he told me he was cowboy camping, which is sleeping outside with no tent, and he kept getting this weird mucusy drop of liquid land on his face. He kept looking around and even yelling, and no one was around him. He told me he wasn't below any trees, so it wasn't tree sap. He never slept outside there again, which leads me to believe he was telling the truth. My own story? I've had other interesting experiences at that remote duty station, but this one was scary. It was the night of the 4th of July, and we weren't on a fire, so the crew was playing horseshoes and having a good time. Everyone went to bed pretty early because we were going to have a hike the next day. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer, and my bed was situated next to a big window. I start dozing off, but I felt awake still. I hear my co-worker standing outside my window asking to come outside. I was laying on my side facing the window, and I didn't look up, but I felt their presence by it. It felt as though something tall was looming over me from the outside. They kept beckoning me and I said no. Pretty quickly their voice started changing into a deeper, raspier and angry voice. They started cursing at me to get the hell out. I just froze. It was a sort of demonic voice. I lay frozen, not moving, while they yelled at me. Eventually it stopped and I fell asleep. I woke up the next day and wanted to ask my co-worker if he was standing outside my window, but I felt too weird. Perhaps this was a mild form of sleep paralysis, but still weird. I live in a downtown area of a relatively small city. A couple blocks from my house, there is a lake with a 5-mile trail around it. In the daytime, it is absolutely beautiful and a very popular attraction, but it tends to be sketchy at night because it's located in a lesser part of town with a much higher homeless and gang population. After dark, some questionable people can appear, and mixed with the eeriness of the lake itself is pretty scary. I've had some pretty strange encounters there, but nothing terrified me as much as this one. This happened about a year ago. The sun was starting to set, and I was questioning whether I should run or not. I should have known not to run if I was questioning it. So I decided I'd do, and set off on my run. I quickly learn that it is getting dark fast. 1.5 miles in, it's pitch black, only with the occasional streetlight giving me something. Around 2 miles I look ahead and see a guy just standing in the middle of the path. As I get closer, this dude just whips it out and starts peeing in the middle of the path, like blatantly. I slow my pace down to assess the situation. Now keep in mind I'm 19, 6 foot, 180 pounds of pure muscle, so I'm not easily intimidated. But this was giving me a very uneasy feeling. I run around the dude on the complete opposite side of the road, and he's just staring at me the whole time. I'm getting freaked out at this point, so I pick up my pace a little bit and out of my comfort zone. It was too late to turn back since I'm already 2 miles out. Up ahead I begin to see another guy standing there. I have no idea of what's going on at this point, so I run around him as well. Another half mile up and there's another guy, and this time he's just staring at me. I'm completely freaked now, so I start sprinting my butt off. Another half a mile from my house, and I hear this ear-piercing screaming behind me. It's like it's coming from 20 different people, but it keeps getting closer as I was sprinting. I book it with all I've got to my house and slam the door. I couldn't sleep for the next 2 nights. It could have just been some weird homeless guys drugged out, but it could have been much worse. Moral of the story: be aware of your surroundings, runners, especially at night. One night, the dog was outside barking, so I got up and went out to look. As I was looking outside, the dog came back in and left me alone standing in the darkness next to the shed. I soon became aware of noises in the shed, but put it down as wind. That is until it moved closer, and I felt a strong sense of dread surge through my body. I listened intently to the sound. It almost sounded like a person was on all fours scuffling around. I heard the noise. It was moving towards the shed door. I fled. I ran inside and slammed the door. I sat down and tried to tell myself that it was just the wind. At first, the dread was going away, but then I could feel it building up again. It felt like it was trying to find a way in, moving back and forth along the walls of the house. Then, I suddenly felt it inside the apartment. It had made its way into the kitchen. I'm still unsure how. The window, perhaps? I could feel it getting slowly closer. I was too afraid to look behind me into the kitchen, but I managed to jump up and slammed the door. I hoped it would leave, and it did. After this, I would hear it sometimes, just scuffling around at night. The alley at the back was dark and smelly, so I assumed it liked it. Now this next bit is truly a fault on my own part. I really should have listened to my own gut feeling. Months later, it's summer, and therefore very warm. I had the back door open, and I was on my laptop as it got dark. At some point, I turned on the light and sat back down. I sat facing the back door. My laptop screen stopped me from seeing the bottom half of the door. After a while, I started hearing movement outside and felt uneasy, but I told myself it was nothing. Yep, I sat there and told myself it couldn't possibly be anything. I know, foolish. The feeling continued to grow stronger. My whole body was screaming at me to run. Then, our dog comes running downstairs, stops in the middle of the room, looks at me, and then goes to walk outside. The way she did this was just odd. I pulled down my screen and watched her head towards the back door. As she walked out, there was this thing. It was a humanoid figure crouched down by the door. Its skin dark brown like dirt and rot, with the texture of a burn victim. Hairless and skinny like it hadn't eaten in months. There it was. This thing that I had been of fear of for so long, right up against the doorframe, trying to make its way inside. The figure twisted its emaciated form around to follow the dog. It was crouched down onto its hands and feet. That's why it made a scuffling noise. I jumped up and threw my laptop to the floor. I ran upstairs and refused to go back down alone. The stupidest thing was that I doubted myself, and if it wasn't for that dog, I don't know what would have happened. Her look towards me when she came downstairs, I can only imagine she was wondering why I wasn't running away. A friend told me it sounds like a skinwalker. I don't know what it was, but I sure am happy that we moved. I used to do wilderness forestry in the Linville, Georgia area of North Carolina. A jack-o'-lantern is a disembodied light that floats in the air. They're commonly reported in the southern Appalachians, but reports are usually disregarded because it's easy to imagine that the person seeing them was seeing something more mundane. I have seen a few things that I suspected were jack-o'-lanterns, but there was one that was plain and clearly just a free floating light out in the open on the east side of Short-Off Mountain, where there are no trails in place that can be accessed by someone with good mountaineering skills and woodcraft. Furthermore, it was floating above brush way too thick for anything to move quickly and smoothly through, if it was walking on the ground. I should point out, there is a confirmed similar phenomenon nearby, the Brown Mountain Lights, that has puzzled people for centuries. On hot summer nights, you can sit at Wise Man's View or pull off on highway east of the gorge and see jack-o'-lanterns dance along Brown Mountain Ridge yourself. This happened quite recently. My brother and I went for a hike to stave off cabin fever from self-isolating. We chose a pretty remote trail to lower the risk of coming into contact with other people. I was walking ahead of my brother, and the gravel on the tracks was making our footsteps sound really loud. Deep in my thoughts, I was listening to the rhythm of his footsteps behind me. About 20 minutes in, I started hearing other footsteps starting off, faint, and getting louder, until they were the same pitch as his, but they were much faster, like a running rhythm. They suddenly came to a halt, and I could hear the motion of someone stopping on gravel. That sudden sharp and rocky sound, if you can imagine it. I assumed there must have been someone running/jogging on the track, and sure enough I saw a shadow to the side of me appear, which looked like a person's head next to mine, as though they were right behind me. I stopped and turned around to let them pass because the track was narrow. However, when I turned, it was just my brother staring back at me. He was confused as to why I'd stopped, so I asked if he was running a second ago and he said no. I asked if there had been anyone behind him, and he said that he wasn't aware of anyone. I thought it was strange, but just let it go and carried on. About 5 minutes later, we came around a corner, and there was the smell of just pure death, like a really strong off-meat smell. We figured it was a dead animal and kept going. We reached the hike lookout after 20 minutes, chilled for a bit and then headed back. We passed the death smell, and then around the exact same spot where it had happened before, I started hearing the running sound again. I ignored it this time, because it was starting to freak me out, and just picked up the pace to get back to the car. I told my mom, and she joked that the death smell must have been a dead jogger, and I was being haunted by them, to which I laughed. But now I'm wondering, what if it was? Should I have gone and investigated the smell? I work in a very remote part of the Appalachians. We once had a few calls in of someone leaving a tent abandoned. Now this isn't uncommon. Sometimes people will go, sleep at a friend's camp for one night and come back, so we didn't fret about it too much. But after about 4 days and us forgetting about that original tent, someone else reported it, but this time reported a very foul smell emanating from it. It was July, it was very hot, and we started to make educated guesses. Over the course of the next few hours, we prepared ourselves for the worst, and we managed to smell the tent before we even saw it. I made my friend undo the zip, and when he opened it, A smell so foul hit my nostrils, I nearly passed out. That's what heat will do, I suppose. Turns out someone had passed away in there, and they'd passed away in style, as they defecated all over the tent as well. The smell was otherworldly. We passed it over to the authorities and didn't get any follow-up. But I do feel sorry for that person, and it makes me wonder how they passed and why. Must have been sad to go in the middle of the woods. By the looks of it, they weren't old either. Must have been about mid-30s. Either way, quite sad, and made me rethink my choice of profession, as I didn't want to find any more of those ever again. My ex-boyfriend and I did a rainforest walk which drops deep down to the bottom of the forest. No other cars in the car park, and I didn't come across any other hikers. We had it all to ourselves and had a great time for the most part. As we were walking up, my ex was ahead of me, and they suddenly stopped, raising his hand up to signal for me to stop with him. I looked up, and there was this woman standing up ahead of us staring. She appeared normal, but I got a chill as soon as I looked at her. She had dark brown hair, which I only noticed because it contrasted so strongly against her cardigan. The cardigan was all I could focus on. It went right down to her feet and was bleach white, totally clean, as if it had just been brought off the rack. I thought about how ridiculous it was to wear this thing while hiking. We stood there totally motionless, just staring back at her for 30 to 40 seconds. We didn't immediately feel threatened, but there was no way I was going to take a step forward towards her. Instead, I felt this kind of weird stillness, as if the forest around us froze and time went silent. She finally turned around and began to walk away up the trail. We watched her and waited, not saying another word, until she was out of sight before we began to walk. The car park was around a half hour away, and we walked in silence, both a bit on edge and trying to listen for any suspicious sounds. We didn't see her or anyone else for the rest of the trail. Still no cars in the car park when we returned. It was absolutely the strangest experience I've ever had outdoors. I was doing some field work for my master thesis on the local river habitat. I have trail cameras to catch wildlife. On my way to find one of my cameras, I heard leaves rustling from the top of the tree, and then a dead deer fell from the tree on the ground. I made some noise and walked away. I thought it was either a bobcat or mountain lion, and I didn't want to investigate in case the animal was still there. As far as I know, bobcats don't climb on trees to carry their prey, and this was a whitetail that looked pretty heavy. I went there a few hours later and the carcass was gone. As far as mountain lions are concerned, we only have rumors of one around our parts, and although I saw tracks, they were not near the cameras. This one time, I went camping when I was 13 with my family up in Michigan, somewhere near where Mount Sugarloaf is. It's around 3 a.m. I'm wide awake reading a comic book that I'd brought. I was a pretty large insomniac, you see, and could only sleep for a few hours at a time, when I hear twigs breaking and leaves rustling somewhere to the back edge of our campsite. It's hard to explain, but I feel not afraid but extremely aware, like how I imagine rabbits feel when they sense a predator is nearby. I remember flipping on my stomach and edging towards my little sister who was against the outer edge of the tent. I wasn't thinking it at the time, but I think I was instinctively moving to protect her from it. I don't know. The sound got closer. It's not loud, but I could tell by the muted steps that it was big. By this time I'm practically on top of my sister, and my eyes are as wide as they can go, desperately trying to see in the minimal light from the moon that filtered through the canvas of the tent. That's when I saw it. The light of the moon outside illuminated this huge shape. It was hard to tell, but it looked like it had a long snout and long ears. I could hear its fur or skin brushing against the tent canvas, and my heart is pounding so hard my ears hurt from it. This thing was sniffing along the tent. I could feel its breath through the thin barrier of the tent. The only thing between me and it. I'm certain this thing would have very happily slaughtered me. And all of a sudden, it stands, its shadow curving along the roof of the tent. I'm waiting for my life to flash before my eyes, but I'm just pulling a blank. All I feel is pure horror, the likes of which I have never felt again. But then it just slowly disappears. Whatever it was chose to leave. The sound of the underbrush as it left was the only thing that convinced me that I wasn't hallucinating. I stayed up for the rest of the night, convinced it was going to return. It didn't, and I have refused to camp anywhere in the Midwest since. I spent the majority of my life in Pennsylvania, so a majority of my hikes have been in the Pennsylvania wilderness. In northeastern Pennsylvania, around the Appalachian Trail, the homeless people congregate and form communities. This isn't creepy, as it gets cold up there. I'm sure it takes a community working together to get through the winters outside. While hiking, it's not unusual to stumble across a community. The creepy part? It is known on the trail that they protect their camps with extreme violence, that if you find one, not to disturb anything. These communities can be pretty big, with 20 to 30 makeshift tents and shelters set up in the middle of the woods. When you accidentally wander across one of their camps, they are always empty, but the fires are still going and food is still cooking. So you know there is a bunch of people straight up watching you that are hiding. I always tried to make sure that I wasn't intentionally looking at any of their tents or belongings, and made sure to make my way out of there as fast as possible. Never once have I seen one of them, so it really makes you feel not that safe. Anytime I wandered into a camp, I made a mental note to never hike that area again, unless in a group. My husband and I were hiking in Jasper Park, Canada. We were talking and passing other hikers every 15 or 20 minutes or so. We got to a part of the trail that reaches the peak, and then slowly starts to move down to the other side of the foothill, and the trail is on the side of a slope. We hadn't seen anyone for maybe half hour, and all of a sudden the entire earth starts to shake, and there was a thunderous noise. We both squat down together and looked frantically around, trying to find the source of the noise, but we saw nothing, and heard nothing like branches breaking. And I thought for sure it was an elk or something, but there wasn't an animal. It would have been on the trailhead ahead of us or behind us. We started to make loud noises, and I began cracking rocks together. We kept doing this until we saw another couple of hikers about 15 minutes later. We asked if they heard or felt anything, and they said no. So we warned them that there may be an animal on a trailhead. It would have been nice to know what it was. I was out walking my dogs in some woods right next to Foxwarren Park in Cobham, England. It's a massive Victorian manor where one of the owners passed away. The walk was normal until I walked into a field that I assumed was privately owned, and I saw an upturned horse box. I don't know why, but it's very unsettling for me, and I started feeling a bit sick and got goosebumps and a strange tingling sensation on my skin. When we left the field and went back into the woods, I still had this strange feeling and felt like we were being watched. On the route back to the car, we walked past a Victorian tower, and I think that was one of the outbuildings from the manor house, but it is now abandoned. The windows are still in, but covered in moss. I could have sworn I saw a humanoid entity with dark hair covering its face in the window. It could be me being paranoid, but I'm convinced that my previous experience has made me sensitive to paranormal activity. I don't know what it was, but I know it wasn't nice. I was a summer camp counselor for the country park department when I was in high school. One late afternoon, I was walking down a trail when I heard a sound of something falling from high up in a tree. Assuming it was a branch, I glanced up, hoping to avoid getting hit. However, I was a bit shocked when about 3 feet away from me landed the most pissed off raccoon I'd ever seen. He bombed into the underbrush, popped up on all fours, and hissed at me like it was my fault he was clumsy. We sort of regarded each other for a moment before for some reason I said out loud, "I'm just gonna keep going this way," and walked on. No rabies for me, thanks.